The House of Tudor gave England its most celebrated monarchs, its most dramatic royal scandals, and its most profound religious transformation. For over 100 years, this remarkable dynasty shaped the very soul of England. They built magnificent palaces, commissioned breathtaking art, and patronised playwrights, whose words still echo through time. The Tudors brought England from medieval obscurity to the threshold of global empire. Their story is one of ambition, passion, betrayal, and enduring legacy. The House of Tudor ruled England from 1485 to 1603. That span of 118 years might seem brief when measured against the great dynasties of history. Yet within those years, England transformed beyond recognition. The country that Henry VII inherited was a war-torn, divided land, still recovering from decades of civil conflict. The country that Elizabeth I left behind was a confident nation, wealthy from trade, feared by its enemies, and blessed with a cultural flowering that produced some of humanity's greatest artistic achievements. To understand the Tudors, we must first understand the England they inherited. Picture yourself standing in the English countryside of the late 1400s. The land stretches before you in rolling hills and dense forests. Small villages dot the landscape, their inhabitants living much as their ancestors had for generations. Most people never travel more than a few miles from their birthplace. They work the land, raise their families, attend their local church, and know little of the wider world. Yet change is coming. The medieval world is slowly giving way to something new. Across Europe, scholars are rediscovering the wisdom of ancient Greece and Rome. Artists are developing new techniques that bring their subjects to vivid life. Merchants are growing wealthy from trade with distant lands. And in the courts of kings, ambitious men dream of power and glory. England in this period is not the great power it will become. France is larger and wealthier. Spain is unifying under Ferdinand and Isabella, preparing for an age of exploration and conquest. The Italian city-states blaze with artistic genius. England is something of a backwater, a medium-sized kingdom on the edge of Europe, known mainly for its wool trade and its seemingly endless civil wars. The Wars of the Roses had torn England apart for 30 years. This brutal conflict pitted two branches of the royal family against each other. The House of Lancaster, whose symbol was a red rose, fought against the House of York, whose symbol was a white rose. Kings were made and unmade. Nobles changed sides with bewildering frequency. Battles raged across the English countryside, and no one seemed able to bring lasting peace. By 1485, England was exhausted. The country desperately needed this stable leadership. The old nobility had been decimated by war. The common people longed for peace and prosperity. Into this moment of crisis stepped an unlikely figure, a Welsh-born exile who had spent most of his life in foreign lands. His name was Henry Tudor, and he would found a dynasty that would change England forever. The Tudor age brought transformations that touched every aspect of English life. Religion changed dramatically as England broke away from the Catholic Church and established its own Protestant faith. The monarchy grew stronger, centralising power in ways that previous kings could only dream of. Trade expanded, bringing new wealth and new ideas from distant shores. Education spread, as grammar schools opened across the land and literacy rates climbed. The arts flourished, producing poetry, drama, and music of extraordinary beauty. The Tudor monarchs themselves were remarkable individuals. Henry VII was a calculating survivor who rebuilt royal finances and brought stability after years of war. Henry VIII was a larger-than-life figure whose personal desires reshaped an entire nation's religious identity. Edward VI was a precocious boy king whose brief reign saw England embrace Protestantism with fervour. Mary I attempted to restore Catholicism, earning a controversial reputation that haunts her memory to this day. and Elizabeth I became one of history's most celebrated rulers, guiding England through dangers at home and abroad while presiding over a golden age of culture. Beyond the monarchs themselves, the Tudor era produced countless fascinating figures. Thomas More was a brilliant scholar who chose death rather than betray his conscience. Thomas Cromwell rose from humble origins to become the architect of the English Reformation, only to fall victim to the king he served. Anne Boleyn captivated a king and changed history, yet met a tragic end on the scaffold. William Shakespeare wrote plays that still move audiences 4 centuries later. Francis Drake sailed around the world and helped defeat the mighty Spanish Armada. The Tudor court was a place of splendour and danger. Magnificent palaces like Hampton Court and Whitehall hosted elaborate entertainments. Courtiers dressed in silks and velvets, competing for royal favour through wit, charm, and political cunning. Yet beneath the glittering surface lurked constant peril. A careless word could mean disgrace. A perceived slight to the monarch could mean imprisonment or death. Ambitious men and women navigated these treacherous waters, some rising to great heights, others falling to terrible fates. Religion during the Tudor period was not merely a matter of personal belief. It was deeply intertwined with politics, identity, and survival. When Henry VIII broke with Rome, he set in motion changes that would divide families, communities, and the entire nation. Catholics and Protestants viewed each other with suspicion and sometimes hatred. People died for their faith, burned at the stake or executed as traitors. The religious settlement that Elizabeth eventually achieved brought a measure of peace, but tensions continued to simmer beneath the surface. The economy of Tudor England was changing rapidly. The wool trade remained important, but new industries were emerging. Coal mining expanded to meet growing demand for fuel. Iron production increased as metalworking techniques improved. Overseas trade brought exotic goods from distant lands. Sugar, spices, tobacco, and other products found eager buyers among those who could afford them. A new merchant class was rising, accumulating wealth and influence that would eventually challenge the old aristocratic order. Education and learning flourished under the Tudors. Henry VIII, despite his later reputation, was a genuine scholar who spoke multiple languages and wrote theological treatises. His children were all educated to the highest standards. Grammar schools spread across England, offering education to boys from middling families. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge trained the clergy, lawyers, and administrators who kept the kingdom running. The printing press, still relatively new, made books more available than ever before, spreading ideas and knowledge to an ever wider audience. The arts reached extraordinary heights during the Tudor period. Poetry flourished, from the elegant sonnets of the early Tudor court to the towering achievements of Edmund Spenser and William Shakespeare. Drama evolved from simple morality plays to sophisticated theatrical productions that drew audiences from all levels of society. Music was cherished at court and in churches, with composers like Thomas Tallis and William Byrd creating works of a haunting beauty. Painting developed new sophistication, with artists like Hans Holbein capturing the Tudor court in vivid detail. Architecture during the Tudor age reflected the wealth and confidence of the era. The great medieval castles gave way to more comfortable manor houses. Wealthy families built grand homes with large windows, elaborate chimneys, and beautiful gardens. Hampton Court Palace, with its magnificent Great Hall and extensive grounds, showcased the splendour of Tudor royal life. Even modest buildings showed Tudor influence in their distinctive half-timbered construction and decorative details. Daily life for ordinary people changed in many ways during the Tudor period, yet in other ways remained much as it had been for centuries. Most people still lived in rural areas, working the land and following the rhythms of the seasons. The village church remained the centre of community life, though the form of worship changed dramatically over the course of the century. Markets and fairs provided opportunities for trade and socialising. Ale houses offered refreshment and companionship. Birth, marriage, and death marked the great transitions of life, celebrated and mourned according to customs both ancient and evolving. The Tudor period saw England begin to look outward to the wider world. Explorers like John Cabot, Sebastian Cabot, and Martin Frobisher ventured across the Atlantic in search of new routes and new lands. Merchants established trading connections with Russia, the Middle East, and eventually the Far East. The first tentative attempts at colonisation began, though permanent English settlements in the Americas would not succeed until after the Tudor era ended. England was beginning its transformation from an insular kingdom to a global power. Military affairs evolved significantly during the Tudor years. The longbow, which had won famous victories at Crécy and Agincourt, gradually gave way to firearms. Artillery became increasingly important in siege warfare. The navy grew from a small collection of ships to a formidable force capable of challenging the greatest maritime powers. The Tudor monarchs understood that military strength was essential to national security, and they invested heavily in defence. Law and government became more sophisticated under the Tudors. Parliament, though still subordinate to the monarch, grew in importance and developed new procedures. The common law courts continued their work, but new courts like the Star Chamber handled cases involving powerful individuals or matters of state security. Local government relied on justices of the peace, unpaid gentlemen who maintained order and administered justice in their communities. A growing bureaucracy of clerks and officials kept records, collected taxes, and implemented royal policies. The Tudor period was also an age of remarkable women. Beyond the queens who ruled in their own right, women like Catherine of Aragon, Anne Boleyn, and Catherine Parr influenced events through their positions as royal consorts. Noble women managed great households, raised children, and sometimes wielded considerable political influence. Women of lower status worked alongside men in fields and workshops, contributing essential labour to the economy. Though formal power remained largely in male hands, women found ways to exercise agency and leave their mark on history. As we prepare to delve deeper into this remarkable era, remember that the Tudors were not merely historical figures in a dusty textbook. They were living, breathing human beings who loved and hated, hoped and feared, triumphed and failed. Their world was as vivid and complex as our own, filled with beauty and cruelty, wisdom and folly. By understanding them, we gain insight not only into the past but into the eternal human condition. So let us begin our journey properly. Let us travel back to the misty hills of Wales, where the Tudor story truly begins. Let us meet the ancestors whose ambitions and struggles set the stage for everything that followed. Let us discover how an obscure Welsh family rose to claim the throne of England and change the course of history. The story of the House of Tudor begins not in the great halls of English power, but in the green valleys and rugged mountains of Wales. To understand how this family came to rule England, we must first journey to a land of ancient traditions, fierce pride, and dreams of past glory. Wales in the medieval period was a conquered land, yet one that had never fully submitted to English rule. The Welsh people remembered their own princes, their own laws, their own language and culture. They cherished tales of King Arthur and other legendary heroes who had resisted foreign invaders. Many Welsh families traced their ancestry back to ancient chieftains and princes, taking immense pride in their noble bloodlines. Among these proud Welsh families were the Tudors. The name itself comes from the Welsh Tudor, and the family could trace its roots deep into Welsh history. They were descended from Ednifed Feision, a powerful nobleman who served Llywelyn the Great, Prince of Wales, in the early 1200s. This connection to the old Welsh princes gave the Tudors a sense of destiny and legitimacy that would prove invaluable in their later rise to power. The family seat was in Anglesey, an island off the northwest coast of Wales. This remote location might seem an unlikely birthplace for a royal dynasty, but it was here that the Tudors accumulated land, influence, and connections over generations. They were not the greatest nobles in Wales, but they were respected and well established. The crucial figure in the Tudor rise was Owen Tudor, sometimes spelled Owain Tudor in the Welsh fashion. Born around 1400, Owen was a handsome and charming young man who made his way to the English court. How exactly he arrived there remains somewhat unclear. Some accounts suggest he served as a page or squire. Others indicate he held a position in the royal household. Whatever the precise circumstances, Owen Tudor found himself in proximity to the highest levels of English power. It was there that Owen encountered Catherine of Valois, the widow of King Henry V. Catherine was a French princess who had married Henry V after his famous victory at the Battle of Agincourt. She had borne him a son, the future Henry VI, before Henry V died suddenly in 1422. Left a young widow in a foreign land, Catherine found herself in a difficult position. The English council that governed during Henry VI's minority was deeply suspicious of Catherine. They feared that if she remarried, her new husband might gain influence over the young king. Laws were passed restricting her ability to marry without royal permission. Yet despite these obstacles, Catherine and Owen Tudor fell in love. Their relationship was kept secret for years. Exactly when they married remains uncertain, and some historians have questioned whether a formal marriage ever took place at all. What is clear is that they lived together as husband and wife and had several children. Their sons included Edmund and Jasper, who would play crucial roles in the events to come. When Catherine died in 1437, the secret relationship was finally revealed. Owen Tudor found himself in serious trouble. He was arrested and his property was seized. For a time, his very life seemed in danger. However, he eventually regained royal favour and was pardoned. His sons Edmund and Jasper were acknowledged as half-brothers to King Henry VI, a connection that would prove enormously significant. Edmund Tudor was created Earl of Richmond, while Jasper Tudor became Earl of Pembroke. These titles elevated the Tudor brothers to the highest ranks of English nobility. They were now major figures in the political landscape, closely connected to the Lancastrian royal family. Edmund Tudor married Margaret Beaufort, a young noblewoman whose own ancestry was crucial to the Tudor claim to the throne. Margaret was descended from John of Gaunt, a son of King Edward III. John of Gaunt had fathered children with his mistress, Catherine Swynford, and these children had later been legitimised under the name Beaufort. Though a later decree had barred the Beauforts from inheriting the throne, their royal blood remained significant. Margaret Beaufort was only about 12 years old when she married Edmund Tudor. He was considerably older, and the marriage was primarily a political alliance designed to strengthen both families. Tragically, Edmund died of plague in 1456, leaving Margaret, a pregnant widow, at just 13 years of age. The birth that followed was difficult and dangerous. Margaret was very young and small in stature. The labour nearly killed both mother and child. But on January 28th, 1457, in Pembroke Castle, Margaret gave birth to a son. She named him Henry, after the king. This child, Henry Tudor, would one day become King Henry VII and found the Tudor dynasty. The circumstances of Henry Tudor's early life were shaped by the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. This devastating civil conflict pitted the House of Lancaster against the House of York in a struggle for the English throne. Both houses were descended from King Edward III, and both claimed the right to rule. Henry Tudor, through his mother Margaret Beaufort, had Lancastrian blood. Through his father Edmund, he was connected to the royal family as well, but his claim to the throne was far from strong. There were many people with better hereditary claims. In the normal course of events, Henry Tudor would never have become king, but the Wars of the Roses were not normal times. The conflict decimated the English nobility, killing off potential claimants one after another. Battles, executions, and political murders thinned the ranks of those who might have stood between Henry Tudor and the throne. Henry's early years were spent under the protection of his uncle Jasper Tudor. When Yorkist forces gained the upper hand, Jasper took the young Henry to Brittany for safety. There, in exile, Henry Tudor grew to manhood. He learned languages, studied history, and observed the political intrigues of the Breton and French courts. He also learned patience, a quality that would serve him well in the years ahead. Margaret Beaufort, meanwhile, remained in England. She remarried twice, always working to advance her son's interests. She was a woman of formidable intelligence and determination. Throughout Henry's long exile, she maintained secret communications with him, plotting and planning for the day when he might return. The Yorkist kings seemed firmly in control of England. Edward IV proved to be a capable ruler who brought a measure of stability after years of chaos. But when Edward died suddenly in 1483, everything changed. Edward IV left two young sons, Edward and Richard. The elder boy was proclaimed King Edward V. But before he could be crowned, his uncle Richard, Duke of Gloucester, seized power. The two princes were placed in the Tower of London, ostensibly for their protection. They were never seen again. Richard, Duke of Gloucester, had himself crowned as King Richard III. His seizure of the throne and the mysterious disappearance of the princes shocked many in England. Richard faced immediate opposition from those who saw him as a usurper and possibly a murderer. For Henry Tudor, this was the opportunity he had been waiting for. Richard III's unpopularity created an opening. Former Yorkists who could not stomach Richard's actions began looking for alternatives. The various strands of opposition gradually coalesced around Henry Tudor as the best hope for removing Richard from power. In 1483, Henry attempted an invasion of England, but bad weather scattered his fleet and the attempt failed. He returned to Brittany to try again. Over the next 2 years, he gathered supporters, secured French backing, and prepared for another attempt. On August 1st, 1485, Henry Tudor set sail from France with a small army of about 2,000 men. He landed in Wales, the land of his ancestors, hoping to gather support as he marched. His Welsh heritage proved valuable. Many Welshmen rallied to his banner, seeing him as one of their own come to claim his rightful place. Henry marched through Wales and into England, his army growing as he went. Richard III gathered his forces to meet the threat. The two armies came together near the town of Market Bosworth in Leicestershire. The Battle of Bosworth Field, fought on August 22, 1485, would decide the fate of England. Richard III had the larger army, but he faced problems of loyalty. Some of his key supporters were suspected of secretly favouring Henry Tudor. The Stanley family, in particular, commanded a significant force but had not committed to either side. The battle itself was fierce but relatively brief. Richard III, whatever his faults, was a brave warrior. When he saw Henry Tudor's position, he led a cavalry charge directly at his rival, hoping to end the battle with a single blow. Richard came close to success, killing Henry's standard-bearer and nearly reaching Henry himself. But at the crucial moment, the Stanleys intervened on Henry's side. Their fresh troops overwhelmed Richard's charge. The king was surrounded and killed, fighting to the last. According to tradition, his crown was found on the battlefield, perhaps under a hawthorn bush, and was placed on Henry Tudor's head right there on the field. Henry Tudor was now King Henry VII of England. The Welsh exile had achieved the impossible. A family that had begun in the hills of Anglesey now ruled one of Europe's major kingdoms. The rise of the Tudors was remarkable by any measure. They had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles through a combination of luck, skill, and determination. Owen Tudor's unlikely romance with the Queen had started them on their path. The Wars of the Roses had eliminated rivals and created opportunities. Henry Tudor's own patience and persistence had seen him through years of exile, and at Bosworth Field, courage and timely support had won the day. Yet Henry VII knew that winning the crown was only the beginning. Keeping it would require all his intelligence and cunning. The Tudor dynasty was born, but its survival was far from assured. Many challenges lay ahead, and the new king would need every ounce of his considerable abilities to meet them. The Welsh roots of the Tudors remained important throughout the dynasty's history. Henry VII proudly displayed the Red Dragon of Wales on his banners. He named his first son Arthur, evoking the legendary British king who had long been a symbol of Welsh pride. The Tudors never forgot where they came from, and the Welsh people never forgot that one of their own had risen to rule England. As we leave the story of Tudor origins, we carry with us an understanding of how improbable their rise truly was. Nothing about their early history suggested that this Welsh family would one day produce some of England's most famous monarchs. Yet through the strange workings of fate, the Tudors emerged from obscurity to shape the destiny of a nation. The man who became King Henry VII of England was shaped by a lifetime of uncertainty and danger. Born in difficult circumstances, raised amid civil war, and forced into exile for most of his youth, Henry Tudor learned early that survival required caution, calculation, and an unwillingness to trust easily. These qualities would define his reign. When Henry claimed the throne after Bosworth Field, he was 28 years old. He was tall and slender, with small blue eyes and thin, somewhat unhealthy-looking features. He did not possess the physical magnificence that his son would later display, but behind that unremarkable exterior lay a sharp mind and an iron will. Henry's first challenge was to secure his hold on the crown. His claim to the throne was weak by hereditary standards. He had won his kingdom by conquest, and he knew that others might try to take it from him by the same means. The supporters of the House of York had not simply disappeared after Bosworth. Many still harboured hopes of reversing the outcome. To strengthen his position, Henry married Elizabeth of York, the eldest daughter of King Edward IV. This union brought together the rival houses of Lancaster and York, symbolised by the famous Tudor rose that combined the red rose of Lancaster with the white rose of York. The marriage was also a genuine success on a personal level. Henry and Elizabeth developed real affection for each other, and she bore him several children. Henry's approach to governing was cautious and methodical. He avoided unnecessary wars which were expensive and risky. He built up the royal treasury, which had been depleted by years of conflict. He rewarded loyal supporters, but kept them on a short leash, never allowing any subject to become too powerful. He used bonds and recognizances, financial instruments that kept nobles in a state of controlled indebtedness to the crown. The king's financial policies were effective, but not always popular. Henry employed agents like Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson to squeeze money from his subjects through various legal and semi-legal means. Wealthy families found themselves targeted for alleged offences, real or invented, and forced to pay heavy fines. These practices filled the royal coffers, but created resentment that would outlast Henry's reign. Henry faced several serious challenges to his throne during his reign. The most dangerous came from pretenders who claimed to be members of the House of York. The first of these was Lambert Simnel, a boy who was presented as Edward, Earl of Warwick, a nephew of Edward IV. In reality, the real Earl of Warwick was a prisoner in the Tower of London, but the pretender gathered support in Ireland and invaded England in 1487. Henry met this threat at the Battle of Stoke Field, sometimes called the last battle of the Wars of the Roses. The royal forces won decisively, and Lambert Simnel was captured. In a characteristic display of pragmatism, Henry did not execute the boy, who was merely a pawn in others' schemes. Instead, he put Simnel to work in the royal kitchens, later promoting him to falconer. It was a subtle way of demonstrating that the pretender was no threat worth taking seriously. A more persistent challenge came from Perkin Warbeck, who claimed to be Richard, Duke of York, the younger of the two princes who had disappeared in the Tower. Warbeck's imposture lasted for years and attracted support from various foreign powers who saw an opportunity to destabilise England. He attempted several invasions, none successful, before finally being captured in 1497. Henry initially treated Warbeck with surprising leniency, keeping him at court under loose supervision. But when Warbeck attempted to escape and then became involved in a plot with the real Earl of Warwick, Henry's patience ran out. Both Warbeck and the Earl of Warwick were executed in 1499. The king had eliminated two threats to his dynasty, though at the cost of killing a young man whose only crime was his royal blood. The execution of the Earl of Warwick removed the last serious Yorkist claimant to the throne. Henry's position was now more secure than ever, but the king's suspicious nature never allowed him to relax completely. He continued to watch for threats, real or imagined, until the end of his life. Henry's foreign policy was generally successful. He avoided expensive wars while maintaining England's position in European affairs. He negotiated marriages for his children that brought prestige and useful alliances. His eldest son, Arthur, was betrothed to Catherine of Aragon, daughter of Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain. This Spanish match was a diplomatic triumph, connecting the Tudor dynasty to one of Europe's most powerful royal houses. The wedding of Arthur and Catherine took place in November 1501, amid great celebration. The young couple were sent to Ludlow Castle in Wales, where Arthur was to learn the business of government as Prince of Wales. But tragedy struck just months later. Arthur fell ill, possibly with sweating sickness, and died in April 1502. He was only 15 years old. Arthur's death was a devastating blow to Henry VII. The king had invested enormous hope in his eldest son, grooming him to continue the Tudor dynasty. Now that hope lay in ruins. Henry's second son, also named Henry, became the new heir to the throne. The younger Henry was just 10 years old when his brother died. The question of what to do with Catherine of Aragon became a pressing diplomatic issue. Her parents wanted her dowry returned if she came back to Spain. Henry VII wanted to keep both the princess and the money. Eventually, a solution was found. Catherine would be betrothed to the new heir, young Prince Henry. A papal dispensation would be required, since Catherine had been married to Henry's brother, but this was obtained. More sorrow followed for the royal family. In February 1503, Queen Elizabeth died shortly after giving birth to a daughter, who also did not survive. Henry VII was genuinely grief-stricken. He had lost his wife, his eldest son, and a newborn daughter within the space of a year. The king withdrew from public life for a time, mourning in private. In his later years, Henry became increasingly obsessed with money and increasingly harsh in his methods of obtaining it. The activities of his financial agents grew more aggressive. Wealthy subjects lived in fear of being targeted for alleged offences. The king accumulated an enormous fortune, but at the cost of his popularity. Henry's health declined in his final years. He suffered from poor eyesight and various ailments. He became more suspicious and more isolated. When he died on April 21st, 1509, at the age of 52, few mourned him deeply. His subjects were ready for a change. Yet Henry VII's achievements were substantial. He had founded a dynasty that would rule England for over a century. He had brought stability after decades of civil war. He had rebuilt royal finances and strengthened royal authority. He had kept England at peace while other nations exhausted themselves in warfare. He had arranged marriages that connected his family to the great royal houses of Europe. Perhaps most importantly, Henry had survived. In an age when kings were made and unmade with alarming frequency, he had held onto his throne for 24 years. He had defeated every challenger and died peacefully in his bed. For a man whose claim to the crown had been so tenuous, this was no small accomplishment. Henry VII was not a lovable king. He inspired respect and fear rather than affection. His methods were sometimes harsh, and his personality was cold. But he was exactly the kind of ruler England needed after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. He provided the stable foundation on which his successors would build. The first Tudor king left his son a peaceful kingdom, a full treasury, and an established dynasty. What the second Tudor king would do with this inheritance would reshape England in ways that Henry VII could never have imagined. When Henry VIII became king in April 1509, England rejoiced. The new monarch was everything his father had not been. Where Henry VII had been cautious, cold, and calculating, his son was bold, warm, and magnificent. Where the father had hoarded money, the son would spend it lavishly. Where the old king had avoided spectacle, the young king embraced it wholeheartedly. Henry VIII was 17 years old when he came to the throne. He was tall, athletic, and strikingly handsome, with auburn hair, a fair complexion, and a powerful physique. He excelled at all the pursuits expected of a Renaissance prince. He was a skilled horseman, a formidable jouster, an accomplished musician, and a genuine intellectual who could discuss theology and philosophy with the leading scholars of his age. The young king seemed to embody all the ideals of Renaissance kingship. He was compared to the sun, to ancient heroes, to everything bright and glorious. Foreign ambassadors reported home that England's new ruler was the most handsome prince in Christendom. His court became a centre of culture and magnificence that rivaled any in Europe. One of Henry's first acts as king was to marry Catherine of Aragon, the Spanish princess who had been widowed by his brother Arthur's death. Catherine was 6 years older than Henry, but she was still an attractive woman, well educated and dignified. More importantly, the marriage maintained the valuable alliance with Spain. The wedding took place just weeks after Henry became king, followed by a joint coronation that was one of the most splendid ceremonies England had ever seen. Henry also moved quickly to distance himself from the unpopular policies of his father's later years. Edmund Dudley and Richard Empson, the hated financial agents who had squeezed money from Henry VII's subjects, were arrested, charged with treason, and executed. The charges were largely fabricated, but their deaths were popular with the public. The new king was signalling that a new era had begun. The early years of Henry's reign were a time of celebration and display. The court was filled with music, dancing, tournaments, and elaborate entertainments. Henry participated enthusiastically in all of these activities. He composed songs, some of which survive to this day. He jousted in tournaments, sometimes in disguise, though everyone knew perfectly well who the tall athletic competitor really was. He hosted magnificent banquets that lasted for hours. Henry gathered around him a circle of brilliant companions. There was Thomas More, the witty lawyer and scholar who would later become Lord Chancellor. There was Thomas Wolsey, the ambitious churchman who would rise to become the most powerful minister in the land. There were poets, musicians, artists, and athletes, all drawn to the glittering court of the young king. Thomas Wolsey deserves particular attention, for he would dominate English government for nearly 2 decades. Wolsey was the son of a butcher from Ipswich, but his intelligence and ambition carried him far. He entered the church, the traditional path of advancement for talented men of humble origins. His administrative abilities brought him to the attention of Henry VII, and under Henry VIII he rose with remarkable speed. By 1515, Wolsey was Lord Chancellor of England and a Cardinal of the Catholic Church. He was also papal legate, giving him supreme authority over the Church in England. No subject had ever held so much power. Wolsey lived in magnificent style, building Hampton Court Palace, which rivalled the king's own residences in splendour. He conducted foreign policy, managed domestic affairs, and handled the day-to-day business of government, while Henry enjoyed the pleasures of kingship. The arrangement suited both men. Henry wanted to be seen as a great king, to enjoy the trappings of royalty, and to pursue his various interests. Wolsey wanted power and was willing to do the hard work of governing. For years this partnership functioned smoothly. Wolsey handled the details while Henry reaped the glory. Foreign affairs occupied much of the early reign. Henry dreamed of military glory, of reviving the conquests of his medieval predecessors. In 1513 he led an army to France, winning a minor engagement known as the Battle of the Spurs, so called because the French cavalry fled so quickly. The campaign achieved little of lasting significance, but it satisfied Henry's desire for martial glory. While Henry was in France, a far more significant battle took place at home. King James IV of Scotland, allied with France, invaded northern England. The Earl of Surrey, commanding the English forces, met the Scots at Flodden Field on September 9th, 1513. The battle was a catastrophe for Scotland. King James was killed, along with much of the Scottish nobility. Scotland would not pose a serious threat to England for a generation. Catherine of Aragon, serving as regent while Henry was abroad, sent her husband a piece of the Scottish king's coat as a trophy. It was a moment of triumph for the Queen, demonstrating her capability as a ruler in her own right. These were happy years for the royal couple, though shadows would eventually fall across their marriage. The great diplomatic event of the early reign was the Field of Cloth of Gold in 1520. Henry met with King Francis I of France near Calais for a summit intended to cement peace between the two nations. The gathering was one of the most spectacular events of the age. Both kings tried to outdo each other in magnificence. Temporary palaces were erected, decorated with the finest materials. Tournaments, banquets, and entertainments continued for weeks. The name Field of Cloth of Gold came from the extravagant use of gold cloth in the decorations and costumes. Thousands of attendants accompanied each monarch. The cost was staggering, but both kings considered it money well spent on prestige. Henry and Francis even wrestled each other, with Francis reportedly throwing Henry to the ground, a humiliation that Henry never forgot. Despite all the pageantry, the Field of Cloth of Gold achieved little of substance. Within a few years, England and France were at war again. The elaborate display of friendship had been just that, a display. But it remained a powerful symbol of Renaissance monarchy at its most magnificent. Henry's relationship with Catherine of Aragon began happily enough. The Queen was intelligent, cultured, and devoted to her husband. She bore him several children, but most died in infancy. Only one child survived, a daughter named Mary, born in 1516. Henry was disappointed not to have a son, but he remained hopeful that a male heir would eventually come. Catherine suffered through pregnancy after pregnancy, each ending in heartbreak. There were stillbirths, miscarriages, and infants who lived only hours or days. The most painful loss came in 1511, when Catherine gave birth to a son named Henry, Duke of Cornwall. The kingdom rejoiced, bonfires were lit, and celebrations continued for days. But the baby died after just 52 days. Catherine was devastated, and Henry, though he tried to comfort her, felt the loss deeply. As the years passed and no son appeared, Henry began to worry about the succession. England had never been ruled by a queen in her own right. The one previous attempt, when Matilda had claimed the throne in the 1100s, had led to civil war. Henry feared that if he died without a male heir, the country would descend into chaos once more. The Wars of the Roses were still within living memory. The thought of England returning to such bloodshed haunted the king. Catherine, for her part, continued to hope and pray for a son. She was deeply religious, spending hours in prayer and observing strict fasts. She believed that God would eventually bless her with the heir England needed. But by the early 1520s, Catherine was approaching 40, and her childbearing years were clearly ending. The prospect of a male heir grew increasingly remote. Henry began to question whether his marriage was cursed. He remembered a passage from the Bible, from the book of Leviticus, which stated that if a man married his brother's widow, the union would be childless. Catherine had been married to Henry's brother Arthur before Arthur's death. Perhaps, Henry reasoned, God was punishing him for this forbidden marriage. The lack of surviving sons seemed to confirm this interpretation. This theological concern became increasingly important to Henry as the 1520s progressed. He convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid in the eyes of God, regardless of the papal dispensation that had permitted it. If the marriage was invalid, then he was free to marry again and father legitimate sons. This line of thinking would eventually lead to one of the most dramatic upheavals in English history. But before we explore that momentous development, let us pause to consider the court over which Henry presided. The Tudor court was the centre of English political, social, and cultural life. To be at court was to be at the heart of power. To be banished from court was to be cast into obscurity. Every ambitious person in England sought access to the king's presence. The court moved frequently among the various royal palaces. Greenwich was a favourite residence, especially in summer. Westminster was used for formal occasions and meetings of Parliament. Windsor Castle served as a fortress and hunting lodge, and Hampton Court, which Henry acquired from Cardinal Wolsey, became one of the grandest palaces in Europe after Henry expanded and improved it. Life at court followed elaborate rituals and ceremonies. The king rose in the morning, attended by gentlemen of the bedchamber. He heard mass in the royal chapel. He dined in state, with dozens of dishes presented in precise order. He received ambassadors, granted audiences, and conducted business. In the evenings there might be music, dancing, or theatrical performances. Every aspect of royal life was governed by protocol and precedent. The court was also a place of constant competition. Courtiers vied for the king's attention and favour. They sought offices, grants of land, and profitable privileges. They formed factions and alliances, supporting friends and undermining rivals. A word of praise from the king could make a career. A frown could destroy one. The stakes were high, and the competition was fierce. Women played important roles at court, though their influence was often exercised indirectly. The queen had her own household, with ladies-in-waiting who attended her. These positions were highly sought after, as they provided access to both the queen and, through her, to the king. Young women from noble families came to court hoping to make advantageous marriages. Some caught the king's eye and became royal mistresses. Henry was not faithful to Catherine. Like most kings of his era, he took mistresses when it pleased him. The most significant of these early affairs was with Elizabeth Blount, a young woman who served in Catherine's household. Elizabeth bore Henry a son in 1590, a boy named Henry Fitzroy. The king acknowledged this illegitimate son and later made him Duke of Richmond, showering him with honours and lands. The existence of Henry Fitzroy proved that the king was capable of fathering sons. This made Catherine's failure to produce a male heir even more frustrating. If Henry could have a healthy son with a mistress, why not with his wife? The question gnawed at the king and strengthened his conviction that something was fundamentally wrong with his marriage. Another mistress who played a role in the Tudor story was Mary Boleyn. She was a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine and came from an ambitious family that was rising in court circles. Mary's affair with Henry lasted several years, though the king never acknowledged any children from this relationship. Mary's significance lies partly in her family connections, for she had a younger sister named Anne, who would soon change everything. The culture of the early Henrician court was vibrant and sophisticated. Henry himself was a genuine patron of the arts. He collected paintings, commissioned music, and supported scholars. The king's own musical compositions, while not masterpieces, show real talent and training. He played multiple instruments and sang well. Music was a constant presence at court, with choirs, instrumentalists, and composers all enjoying royal patronage. Scholars and intellectuals found welcome at Henry's court. The king corresponded with the great humanist Erasmus of Rotterdam. Thomas More, one of the finest minds of the age, served Henry in various capacities before becoming Lord Chancellor. The court attracted poets, philosophers, and theologians, all eager to bask in royal favour and contribute to the intellectual life of the realm. Architecture flourished under Henry's patronage. The king was a great builder, constantly expanding and improving his palaces. He added tennis courts, bowling alleys, and hunting parks. He installed modern conveniences and luxurious decorations. His building projects provided employment for thousands and left a lasting mark on the English landscape. The navy received particular attention from Henry. He understood that England's security depended on controlling the seas around the island. He built new warships, including the famous Mary Rose and the Henri Grâce à Dieu, one of the largest ships of its time. He established dockyards at Deptford and Woolwich. He created the foundations of what would eventually become the Royal Navy, the instrument of English maritime power for centuries to come. Henry also invested in coastal defences. A chain of fortifications was built along the southern and eastern coasts to protect against invasion. These castles and blockhouses, many of which still stand today, reflected the latest developments in military architecture. They were designed to withstand artillery bombardment and to mount guns of their own. England was preparing to defend itself in an age of gunpowder warfare. Religion, in the early part of Henry's reign, remained firmly Catholic. Henry was a devout son of the Church who heard Mass daily and took his religious obligations seriously. When Martin Luther began the Protestant Reformation in Germany in 1517, Henry was among those who opposed the new teachings. In 1521, Henry published a book defending the Catholic sacraments against Luther's attacks. Pope Leo X was so pleased that he granted Henry the title Defender of the Faith, a title that English monarchs still bear today. The irony of Henry receiving this title would become apparent within a decade, when he would break with the very church he had defended. But in the early 1520s, no one could have predicted such a dramatic reversal. Henry seemed like a pillar of Catholic orthodoxy, a king who would never waver in his loyalty to Rome. Cardinal Wolsey remained the dominant figure in English government throughout this period. He managed foreign policy with skill, keeping England relevant in European affairs despite its relatively modest resources. He attempted legal and administrative reforms, though with mixed success. He accumulated wealth and power on a scale that made him many enemies. But as long as he retained the king's favour, Wolsey seemed unassailable. The cardinal's fall would come suddenly and dramatically, triggered by his failure to solve the king's great matter, the annulment of Henry's marriage to Catherine of Aragon. But that story belongs to the next chapter of our narrative, when the young woman named Anne Boleyn entered the king's life and set in motion events that would transform England forever. As we close this portion of Henry's story, let us remember the young king as he was in these early years. He was handsome, athletic, cultured, and charming. He presided over a brilliant court and enjoyed the love of his people. He had not yet become the bloated tyrant of his later years, the king who would execute wives and ministers with chilling ease. That Henry was still in the future, for now we see a Renaissance prince in his glory, a king who seemed to have everything except the one thing he wanted most: a son to carry on his dynasty. The story of Henry VIII's 6 wives is perhaps the most famous chapter in all of Tudor history. It is a tale of love and ambition, of religious upheaval and political calculation, of tragedy and survival. Through these 6 marriages, we can trace the transformation of Henry himself, from the golden prince of his youth to the fearsome tyrant of his final years. Let us begin with Anne Boleyn, the woman who changed everything. Anne was born around 1501, the daughter of Thomas Boleyn, an ambitious courtier, and Elizabeth Howard, whose family connections reached into the highest levels of the English nobility. As a young girl, Anne was sent abroad to complete her education, spending time at the courts of the Netherlands and France. She returned to England in 1522, a polished and sophisticated young woman. Anne was not considered a great beauty by the standards of her time. She was dark-haired and dark-eyed in an era that prized fair colouring. She had a long neck and a small mole on her throat. Some hostile sources claimed she had a 6th finger on one hand, though this was likely propaganda invented after her fall. What Anne possessed in abundance was charm, wit, and intelligence. She was a brilliant conversationalist, a skilled musician, and a graceful dancer. She knew how to captivate and how to keep a man interested. Henry first noticed Anne around 1526, when she was serving as a lady-in-waiting to Queen Catherine. The king was approaching his mid-30s, still handsome and vigorous, but increasingly frustrated by his lack of a male heir. Anne was young, vivacious, and utterly unlike the ageing Catherine. Henry was smitten, but Anne was not willing to become merely another royal mistress, used and then discarded like her sister Mary had been. She refused to sleep with the king unless he married her. This bold strategy was either brilliantly calculated or genuinely principled, perhaps both. Whatever her motives, Anne's refusal only inflamed Henry's desire. The more she held back, the more desperately he wanted her. Henry convinced himself that his marriage to Catherine was invalid and that he was therefore free to marry Anne. He instructed Cardinal Wolsey to obtain an annulment from Pope Clement VII. Wolsey threw himself into the task, knowing that his position depended on success. But the situation was complicated by European politics. Catherine of Aragon was the aunt of Emperor Charles V, the most powerful ruler in Europe. Charles had recently sacked Rome and held the Pope virtually prisoner. Clement was in no position to offend the emperor by annulling his aunt's marriage. The annulment proceedings dragged on for years. A special court was convened in England, with Cardinal Campeggio sent from Rome to join Wolsey in hearing the case. Catherine appeared before the court and delivered an impassioned defence of her marriage. She knelt before Henry and asked what she had done to deserve such treatment. She insisted that her marriage to Arthur had never been consummated and that her union with Henry was therefore valid. Then she walked out of the court and refused to return. The court eventually adjourned without reaching a decision, referring the case back to Rome. This was a disaster for Wolsey. He had failed to deliver what the king wanted. Henry's patience, never his strongest quality, was exhausted. Anne Boleyn and her supporters whispered against the cardinal, blaming him for the delays In October 1529, Wolsey was stripped of his offices and his property. He was charged with praemunire, the offence of exercising papal authority in England without royal permission. The cardinal who had ruled England for nearly 20 years was ruined. Wolsey died in November 1530 while travelling to London to face trial. According to tradition, his last words were, "If I had served God as diligently as I have done the king, he would not have given me over in my grey hairs." It was a fitting epitaph for a man who had devoted his life to serving an earthly master. With Wolsey gone, Henry needed new advisers to solve his matrimonial problem. The man who emerged to fill this role was Thomas Cromwell, another figure of humble origins who had risen through ability and ambition. Cromwell had served Wolsey and had learned much from the cardinal, but where Wolsey had tried to work within the existing system, Cromwell proposed something far more radical. Cromwell's solution was breathtakingly simple. If the Pope would not grant an annulment, England would break with the Pope. The king would declare himself the supreme head of the Church in England, answerable to no foreign authority. English courts would then grant the annulment that Rome refused to provide. It was a revolutionary proposal that would transform England's religious and political landscape. The break with Rome was accomplished through a series of parliamentary acts between 1532 and 1534. The Act of Supremacy declared Henry the supreme head of the Church of England. The Act of Succession declared the children of Henry and Anne Boleyn to be the legitimate heirs to the throne, implicitly bastardizing Princess Mary. The Treason Act made it a capital offence to deny the king's supremacy or to call him a heretic or tyrant. Henry and Anne were secretly married in January 1533, even before the annulment from Catherine was finalised. Anne was already pregnant, and Henry was desperate for the child to be born legitimate. In May, the new Archbishop of Canterbury, Thomas Cranmer, declared Henry's marriage to Catherine null and void. A few days later, he declared Henry's marriage to Anne valid. Anne was crowned queen in a magnificent ceremony at Westminster Abbey. On September 7, 1533, Anne gave birth at Greenwich Palace. The child was healthy and strong, but it was a girl. She was named Elizabeth, after Henry's mother. The king was deeply disappointed. He had broken with Rome, defied the Pope, and turned European politics upside down, all for a daughter. But he remained hopeful that sons would follow. The break with Rome had profound consequences that extended far beyond Henry's personal life. England was now cut off from the Catholic Church that had shaped its religious life for nearly 1,000 years. Monasteries and convents, which had been centres of learning, charity, and economic activity, were dissolved and their lands seized by the crown. Religious images were removed from churches. Saints' shrines that had attracted pilgrims for centuries were destroyed. The very fabric of English religious life was torn apart and rewoven in a new pattern. Not everyone accepted these changes willingly. Some resisted openly and paid with their lives. Thomas More, the brilliant scholar who had served as Lord Chancellor, refused to take an oath acknowledging the king's supremacy over the church. He was imprisoned in the Tower of London and eventually executed in July 1535. On the scaffold, More declared himself the king's good servant, but God's first. He was later canonised as a saint by the Catholic Church. John Fisher, the elderly Bishop of Rochester, also refused the oath and was executed. Monks and nuns who resisted the dissolution of their houses were imprisoned or killed. The Pilgrimage of Grace, a massive uprising in northern England in 1536, protested the religious changes and the dissolution of the monasteries. Henry suppressed the rebellion with a combination of promises and force, then executed many of its leaders despite having granted them pardons. Meanwhile, Anne Boleyn's position was becoming precarious. She had failed to produce the promised male heir. Her second pregnancy ended in miscarriage. Her third pregnancy, in January 1536 ended in the stillbirth of a male child. Henry was devastated and began to believe that this marriage too was cursed. He had already noticed another lady at court, the quiet and submissive Jane Seymour, who seemed everything that the sharp-tongued Anne was not. In May 1536, Anne Boleyn was arrested and charged with adultery, incest and treason. She was accused of having affairs with 5 men, including her own brother George. The charges were almost certainly false, manufactured by Thomas Cromwell and others who wanted to remove her. The evidence was flimsy, the trials were rushed, and the verdicts were predetermined. Anne and the 5 accused men were all found guilty and sentenced to death. Anne Boleyn was executed on May 19, 1536, on Tower Green, within the walls of the Tower of London. A skilled swordsman was brought from France to perform the execution, a small mercy that allowed for a quicker death than the axe would provide. Anne met her end with a remarkable composure, making a short speech that carefully avoided criticising the king. She knelt, said her prayers, and the sword fell. She was approximately 35 years old. Just 11 days after Anne's execution, Henry married Jane Seymour. Jane was the opposite of Anne in almost every way. Where Anne had been dark, Jane was fair. Where Anne had been witty and outspoken, Jane was quiet and demure. Where Anne had pushed for religious reform, Jane favoured traditional Catholic practices. Her motto was, bound to obey and serve, a pointed contrast to Anne's more assertive style. Jane gave Henry what he most wanted. On October 12, 1537, she gave birth to a healthy son at Hampton Court Palace. The boy was named Edward, and he would eventually become King Edward VI. The kingdom rejoiced, bonfires were lit, bells were rung, and celebrations continued for days. Henry finally had his male heir. But the joy was short-lived. Jane developed a fever after the birth, probably from an infection contracted during the long and difficult labour. She died on October 24, 1537, just 12 days after Edward's birth. Henry was genuinely grief-stricken. Of all his wives, Jane seems to have come closest to his ideal of what a queen should be. When Henry himself died 10 years later, he was buried beside her. Henry remained a widower for over 2 years after Jane's death. Thomas Cromwell, now the king's chief minister, searched for a suitable bride among the princesses of Europe. The choice eventually fell on Anne of Cleves, a German princess whose family was allied with the Protestant princes of the Holy Roman Empire. A marriage alliance would strengthen England's position against the Catholic powers. Hans Holbein, the great court painter, was sent to paint Anne's portrait. The image he produced showed an attractive, pleasant-faced young woman. Henry was satisfied and agreed to the match. But when Anne arrived in England in December 1539, Henry was horrified. He found her unattractive and complained that she looked nothing like her portrait. He called her a Flanders mare, though this famous insult may be apocryphal. The wedding went ahead anyway, as the diplomatic situation required it, but Henry could not bring himself to consummate the marriage. He complained to his doctors that he had no desire for Anne and could not perform his husbandly duties. The marriage was a disaster from the start. Fortunately for Anne, she was intelligent enough to see which way the wind was blowing. When Henry sought an annulment, she cooperated fully. She testified that the marriage had never been consummated and agreed to the dissolution. In return, she received a generous settlement, including houses, lands, and a substantial income. She was given the title King's beloved sister and remained in England for the rest of her life, outliving Henry by 10 years. Of all Henry's wives, Anne of Cleves arguably had the happiest ending. Thomas Cromwell was not so fortunate. He had arranged the Cleves marriage, and its failure was blamed on him. His enemies at court, who had long resented his power and his lowly origins, moved against him. He was arrested in June 1540, charged with treason and heresy, and executed in July. Like Wolsey before him, Cromwell discovered that serving Henry VIII was a dangerous occupation. On the very day of Cromwell's execution, Henry married his fifth wife, Catherine Howard. Catherine was a cousin of Anne Boleyn, another member of the powerful Howard family. She was young, probably only about 17, while Henry was nearly 50. She was lively and flirtatious, and she made the aging king feel young again. But Catherine had a past. Before coming to court, she'd been involved with a music teacher named Henry Manox, and had conducted a more serious affair with a young man named Francis Dereham. These relationships were not necessarily scandalous by the standards of the time, as Catherine had not yet been betrothed to anyone, but they became deadly when combined with her behaviour after marriage. Catherine appears to have conducted an affair with Thomas Culpeper, a gentleman of the king's privy chamber, after becoming queen. Whether the affair was ever physically consummated remains uncertain, but the emotional involvement was clear from letters that survived. When evidence of Catherine's past and present indiscretions reached the king, he was devastated. He reportedly wept openly when informed of his wife's betrayal. Catherine Howard was arrested and charged with treason. She was executed on February 13, 1542, on the same spot where her cousin Anne Boleyn had died 6 years earlier. She was probably no more than 21 years old. According to tradition, she practiced placing her head on the block the night before her execution, wanting to die with dignity. Henry's sixth and final wife was Catherine Parr, a twice-widowed woman of 31, when she married the king in July 1543. Catherine was intelligent, well-educated, and deeply interested in religious reform. She had been planning to marry Thomas Seymour, brother of the late Queen Jane, when the king's interest forced her to change her plans. She accepted her duty and became queen. Catherine Parr was a stabilising influence in Henry's final years. She helped reconcile the king with his daughters Mary and Elizabeth, both of whom had been declared illegitimate at various points. She supervised the education of the young Prince Edward and created something like a normal family life for Henry's 3 children. She was a published author, the first woman to publish a book under her own name in England. Catherine came close to disaster in 1546 when her religious views attracted the attention of conservative enemies at court. They persuaded Henry to sign a warrant for her arrest, but Catherine learned of the danger and threw herself on the king's mercy, claiming that she had only discussed theology with him to learn from his superior wisdom. Henry was mollified, and when the guards came to arrest her, he sent them away, calling them knaves. Catherine had survived where others had fallen. Henry VIII died on January 28, 1547, at the age of 55. He had reigned for nearly 38 years, longer than any English king since Edward III. He left behind a transformed nation. England was no longer Catholic but Protestant, no longer subject to papal authority but governed by a monarch who was supreme in both church and state. The monasteries were gone, their lands in the hands of a new class of Protestant gentry. The religious changes Henry had begun would continue under his successors, shaping English identity for centuries to come. Henry also left behind 3 children who would each wear the crown. Edward, the longed-for son, was only 9 years old. Mary, Catherine of Aragon's daughter, was 31 and firmly Catholic. Elizabeth, Anne Boleyn's daughter, was 13 and would eventually become one of England's greatest monarchs. The succession would prove turbulent, but the Tudor dynasty would endure for another 56 years. The 6 wives of Henry VIII have become legendary figures, their fates memorised by school children through rhymes and mnemonics. Divorced, beheaded, died, divorced, beheaded, survived. Behind this simple formula lie complex human stories of love, ambition, faith, and survival. Each woman navigated the dangerous waters of Henry's court as best she could. Some succeeded, some failed, but all left their mark on history. When Henry VIII died in January 1547, his 9-year-old son became King Edward VI. The boy who now wore the crown was the answer to his father's prayers, the male heir for whom Henry had broken with Rome, married 6 times, and executed countless opponents. Young Edward carried the weight of enormous expectations on his small shoulders. Edward had been raised with all the care befitting a precious heir. His health was closely monitored, his education was supervised by the finest scholars, and his household was staffed by carefully chosen attendants. He was a serious, studious child who showed genuine intellectual ability. He learned Latin, Greek, and French. He studied theology, history, and the classics. He kept a journal in which he recorded his thoughts on government and religion. The young king was also deeply committed to the Protestant faith. Unlike his father, who had broken with Rome for political reasons, while maintaining many Catholic practices, Edward was a convinced Protestant who wanted to complete the Reformation in England. He would have only 6 years to pursue this goal, but in that brief time he would transform English religion more thoroughly than his father had done in nearly 4 decades. Because Edward was a minor, the government was placed in the hands of a regency council. The dominant figure on this council was Edward Seymour, Duke of Somerset, the king's uncle on his mother's side. Somerset took the title of Lord Protector and governed England in the young king's name. He was an ambitious man who believed in Protestant reform and social justice, though his methods often created more problems than they solved. Somerset's religious policies pushed England firmly in a Protestant direction. The Act of Uniformity of 1549 required all churches to use a new Book of Common Prayer, written primarily by Thomas Cranmer, the Archbishop of Canterbury. This prayer book replaced the Latin Mass with English services, making worship accessible to ordinary people who did not understand Latin. It was a revolutionary change that transformed the experience of religion for millions of English men and women. The new prayer book was beautiful in its language, and many of its phrases remain familiar today, but it was also controversial. Catholics objected to the elimination of traditional practices. Even some Protestants felt it did not go far enough in breaking with the old ways. In the West Country, a rebellion broke out against the new prayer book. The rebels demanded a return to the Latin Mass and the restoration of traditional ceremonies. The uprising was suppressed with considerable bloodshed. Another rebellion erupted in Norfolk, led by Robert Kett. This uprising was primarily about economic grievances rather than religion. Peasants protested against enclosure, the practice of wealthy landowners fencing off common lands for their own use. Kett's rebellion attracted thousands of supporters before it was crushed by government forces. Kett himself was executed, his body hung in chains from the walls of Norwich Castle, as a warning to others. These rebellions weakened Somerset's position. His fellow councillors blamed him for mishandling the crises. In October 1549, Somerset was overthrown in a coup led by John Dudley, Earl of Warwick, who would later become Duke of Northumberland. Somerset was imprisoned in the Tower of London. He was eventually released but never regained real power. In 1552 he was arrested again on charges of plotting against Northumberland and was executed. Northumberland proved to be a more effective administrator than Somerset, though he was also more ruthless. He continued the Protestant religious reforms, introducing a second Book of Common Prayer in 1552 that was even more clearly Protestant than the first. Catholic practices were further suppressed. Altars were removed from churches and replaced with simple communion tables. Religious images that had survived earlier purges were destroyed. England was becoming one of the most Protestant countries in Europe. Edward VI supported these changes enthusiastically. Despite his youth, he took an active interest in religious matters and pushed for further reform. He attended sermons regularly and discussed theology with leading Protestant thinkers. He believed that he was doing God's work by purifying the English Church of Catholic corruption. The young king's health, however, was failing. In early 1553, Edward contracted what was probably tuberculosis. He grew weaker month by month, coughing blood and struggling to breathe. It became clear that he would not live much longer. The question of succession became urgent. Under Henry VIII's will and the Act of Succession, the crown should pass first to Edward's half-sister, Mary, then to his half-sister, Elizabeth. But Mary was a devout Catholic, who would certainly reverse Edward's Protestant reforms. The young king could not bear the thought of his religious work being undone. Northumberland, who had his own reasons for wanting to exclude Mary, encouraged Edward to change the succession. Edward drew up a document called the Devise for the Succession, which excluded both Mary and Elizabeth from the throne. Instead, the crown would pass to Lady Jane Grey, a great-granddaughter of Henry VII and a committed Protestant. Conveniently for Northumberland, Lady Jane had recently married his son, Guildford Dudley. If Jane became queen, Northumberland would remain the power behind the throne. The legal basis for this change was questionable at best. Edward was a minor and arguably did not have the authority to alter the succession established by Parliament. But the dying king was determined, and his counsellors, whether from conviction or fear, went along with the plan. Edward VI died on July 6, 1553, at Greenwich Palace. He was 15 years old. His brief reign had seen England transformed into a Protestant nation, with new forms of worship, new religious teachings, and a new relationship between church and state. Whether these changes would survive his death remained to be seen. The young king was buried in Westminster Abbey, with Protestant rites. Thomas Cranmer preached the funeral sermon, praising Edward as a godly prince who had done more for true religion than any of his predecessors. It was a fitting tribute to a boy who had taken his religious responsibilities with the utmost seriousness. Edward's legacy is often overshadowed by the more dramatic reigns of his father and sisters, but his importance should not be underestimated. The religious settlement he established, though it would be temporarily reversed under Mary, provided the foundation for the Elizabethan Church that followed. The Book of Common Prayer, in revised forms, would shape English worship for centuries. The Protestant identity that Edward fostered would become central to English national consciousness. The boy king also left behind a poignant human story. He was a child burdened with responsibilities beyond his years, a prince who never had the chance to grow into the man he might have become. His journal reveals a thoughtful, conscientious young person trying to do his duty as he understood it. Whatever we think of his religious policies, we can recognise in Edward a sincere believer who acted according to his convictions. The death of Edward VI set in motion one of the most dramatic succession crises in English history. For 9 days England had a queen whose reign was so brief and so contested that she is often omitted from lists of English monarchs. Her name was Lady Jane Grey, and her story is one of the most tragic in the Tudor saga. Jane Grey was born in 1537, the same year as Edward VI. She was the eldest daughter of Henry Grey, Duke of Suffolk, and Frances Brandon, who was the daughter of Henry VIII's sister Mary. This lineage gave Jane a claim to the throne, though it was distant compared to the claims of Mary and Elizabeth Tudor. Jane was raised as a Protestant and received an excellent education. She was fluent in Latin, Greek, and Hebrew, and she could hold her own in theological debates with the leading scholars of the age. By all accounts, she was a serious, studious young woman who preferred books to the frivolities of court life. She had little interest in power or politics. Jane's parents, however, had great ambitions for their daughter. They saw her royal blood as a path to influence and advancement. When the Duke of Northumberland proposed a marriage between Jane and his son, Guildford Dudley, the Greys eagerly agreed. Jane herself was reluctant, but her parents overruled her objections. The wedding took place in May 1553, just weeks before Edward VI's death. When Edward died on July 6th, Northumberland moved quickly to secure Jane's position. On July 10th, Jane was brought to the Tower of London, the traditional residence of monarchs before their coronation. There she was informed that Edward had named her his successor and that she was now Queen of England. Jane was shocked and frightened. She reportedly fainted upon hearing the news and initially refused to accept the crown, but she was eventually persuaded or pressured into compliance. Jane's proclamation as Queen was met with a lukewarm response in London. The common people, who had loved Henry VIII despite his faults, felt loyalty to his daughter Mary. The legal case for Jane's succession was weak, and many suspected that Northumberland was simply trying to maintain his own power. Support for the new queen was thin. Mary Tudor, meanwhile, had fled to East Anglia, where she had strong support among the local gentry. She proclaimed herself the rightful queen and began gathering an army. Supporters flocked to her banner. The council in London watched nervously as Mary's forces grew while Jane's support crumbled. Northumberland led an army out of London to confront Mary, but his troops began deserting almost immediately. The councillors he left behind in London, sensing which way the wind was blowing, switched their allegiance to Mary. On July 19th, just 9 days after Jane had been proclaimed queen, the council declared Mary the rightful sovereign. Jane's brief reign was over. Jane received the news with apparent relief. She had never wanted the crown and was glad to be rid of it. She reportedly said that she was content to give up the throne and hoped that Mary would spare her life. For a time it seemed that her hope might be fulfilled. Mary was inclined toward mercy, recognising that Jane had been a pawn in Northumberland's schemes rather than an active conspirator. Northumberland himself was not so fortunate. He was arrested, tried, and executed in August 1553. On the scaffold, he renounced his Protestant faith and declared himself a Catholic, hoping perhaps that this last-minute conversion might save him. It did not. The man who had dominated English politics for 4 years died despised by both Catholics and Protestants alike. Catholics saw his conversion as insincere opportunism. Protestants viewed it as a shameful betrayal of everything he had claimed to believe. Jane and her husband Guildford remained prisoners in the Tower of London, but their lives were spared. Mary seemed content to let them live out their days in comfortable captivity. Jane spent her time reading, praying, and corresponding with religious scholars. She remained firmly Protestant, despite pressure to convert to Catholicism. Her letters from this period reveal a young woman of remarkable faith and intellectual courage. The situation changed dramatically in early 1554. A rebellion broke out against Mary's planned marriage to Philip of Spain. The uprising, known as Wyatt's Rebellion, after its leader Thomas Wyatt, aimed to prevent the Spanish match and possibly to place Elizabeth on the throne. The rebels marched on London and came close to success before being defeated. Wyatt's rebellion sealed Jane Grey's fate. Although Jane had no involvement in the uprising, her very existence posed a threat to Mary's security. As long as Jane lived, she could serve as a figurehead for Protestant conspiracies. Mary's counsellors urged her to eliminate this danger. Reluctantly, the Queen agreed. Jane was informed that she would be executed on February 12, 1554. She was just 16 years old. In her final days, she wrote letters to her family and prepared herself spiritually for death. She refused all attempts to convert her to Catholicism, telling the priests sent to her that she was confident in her Protestant faith and had no need of his services. On the morning of her execution, Jane watched from her window as her husband Guildford was led to his death on Tower Hill. She saw his headless body brought back in a cart, the head wrapped in a cloth. It was a terrible sight, but Jane maintained her composure. She knew that her own turn would come within hours. Jane was executed on Tower Green, within the walls of the Tower, a privilege reserved for those of royal blood. She made a short speech, acknowledging that she had accepted the crown wrongfully, but insisting that she had never sought it. She asked the small crowd of witnesses to pray for her and forgave the executioner. Then she knelt and placed her head on the block. At the last moment Jane was blindfolded and became disoriented. She could not find the block and cried out, "What shall I do? Where is it?" Someone guided her hands to the wood. She laid her head down and spoke her final words, "Lord, into thy hands I commend my spirit." The axe fell, and Lady Jane Grey was dead. Jane's execution was one of the saddest episodes in Tudor history. She was an innocent young woman caught up in the ambitions of others. She had never sought power and had tried to refuse the crown when it was offered. Her only crime was her royal blood and her Protestant faith. She died with dignity and courage that impressed even her enemies. The story of the 9 Days Queen has resonated through the centuries. Artists have painted her final moments. Writers have told her story in novels and plays. She has become a symbol of innocence destroyed by political machinations. In an age of ruthless power struggles, Jane Grey stands out as a victim rather than a participant, a reminder of the human cost of dynastic politics. Jane's parents survived her, though her father was executed shortly afterward for his involvement in Wyatt's rebellion. Her mother Frances lived until 1559, long enough to see Elizabeth become queen. The Grey family's ambitions had brought them nothing but tragedy. The brief reign of Lady Jane Grey is often treated as a mere footnote to Tudor history, a curious interlude between the reigns of Edward and Mary. But it deserves attention in its own right. It reveals the fragility of royal power and the dangers of succession crises. It shows how quickly political fortunes could change in Tudor England, and it gives us one of the most poignant personal stories of the entire era. As we leave Jane Grey's story, let us remember her not as a failed queen, but as a remarkable young woman. Her learning, her faith, and her courage in the face of death set her apart. She deserved a better fate than the one she received. In a kinder world, she might have lived a long and happy life as a scholar and a mother. Instead, she became a martyr to the ambitions of others, her life cut short at 16. Mary Tudor became Queen of England in July 1553, the first woman to rule England in her own right since the disputed reign of Matilda 4 centuries earlier. She was 37 years old, unmarried, and determined to undo the religious changes that had torn her world apart. Her reign would be brief and controversial, earning her a reputation that has endured for nearly 500 years. To understand Mary, we must understand the traumas that shaped her. She was born in 1516, the only surviving child of Henry VIII and Catherine of Aragon. For the first 17 years of her life, she was the adored princess, heir to the throne, betrothed to various European princes. She received an excellent education and was raised in luxury befitting her status. Then everything changed. Her father's desire for a male heir led him to seek an annulment from her mother. When Catherine refused to accept the annulment, she was banished from court. Mary was separated from her mother and would never see her again. She was declared illegitimate, stripped of her title as princess, and forced to serve as a lady-in-waiting to her infant half-sister, Elizabeth. The psychological impact of these events cannot be overstated. Mary had gone from being a princess to being a bastard, from being heir to the throne to being a servant in her half-sister's household. She was pressured to acknowledge that her parents' marriage had been invalid and that she herself was illegitimate. For years she resisted, clinging to her Catholic faith and her belief in her mother's honour. Eventually, broken by isolation and threats, she signed the documents her father demanded. She never forgave herself for this surrender. Mary's Catholic faith sustained her through these dark years. She continued to hear Mass privately, even when Protestant reforms made this increasingly dangerous. She corresponded secretly with the Emperor Charles V, her cousin, who offered support and encouragement. She waited and prayed for better times. Those better times seemed to arrive when Mary became queen. She entered London in triumph, cheered by crowds who remembered her mother and resented the religious changes of the previous reign. She was determined to restore Catholicism, to reconcile England with Rome, and to undo everything that had been done since her father's break with the Pope. Mary moved cautiously at first. She understood that religious change could not be accomplished overnight. Many of her subjects had grown accustomed to Protestant worship and would not easily return to the old ways. The lands seized from the monasteries were now in the hands of powerful families who would resist any attempt to reclaim them. Mary had to balance her religious convictions against political realities. The Queen's first major decision was her choice of husband. Mary was determined to marry, both to produce an heir and to have a partner in her great work of restoration. Her choice fell on Philip of Spain, son of Emperor Charles V and heir to the Spanish throne. Philip was 11 years younger than Mary, but he was Catholic, powerful and willing. The Spanish match was deeply unpopular in England. Many feared that England would become a mere appendage of the Spanish Empire. They worried that Philip would drag England into Spain's endless wars. They resented the prospect of a foreign king ruling over them. Wyatt's rebellion, which we discussed earlier, was partly motivated by opposition to the marriage. Despite the opposition, Mary was determined. She and Philip were married in Winchester Cathedral in July 1554. The marriage treaty carefully protected English interests, limiting Philip's power and ensuring that England would not be drawn into Spanish wars without Parliament's consent. But many remained suspicious of Spanish influence. The marriage was not a happy one. Philip found Mary unattractive and was dismayed by her obvious devotion to him. He spent as little time in England as possible, preferring the more congenial surroundings of the Spanish Netherlands. Mary loved her husband deeply and was heartbroken by his frequent absences. She longed for children, but suffered 2 false pregnancies that left her humiliated and despairing. Mary's religious restoration proceeded despite these personal sorrows. Parliament repealed the religious legislation of Henry VIII and Edward VI. England was formally reconciled with Rome in November 1554, when Cardinal Reginald Pole arrived as papal legate and absolved the nation of its schism. The old Catholic ceremonies were restored. Priests who had married during the Protestant years were required to put away their wives. The clock was being turned back, but Mary went further than mere restoration. She was determined to root out Protestant heresy and to punish those who persisted in their errors. In February 1555, the first Protestant was burned at the stake for heresy. His name was John Rogers, a biblical scholar who had helped produce an English translation of the Bible. He went to his death singing psalms, refusing to recount his beliefs. Rogers was only the first of many. Over the next 3.5 years, nearly 300 Protestants were burned for heresy. They included bishops, priests, and ordinary lay people. They included men and women, old and young, rich and poor. The burnings took place in towns across England, public spectacles intended to terrify others into conformity. The most famous of the martyrs were the Protestant bishops, Hugh Latimer, Nicholas Ridley, and Thomas Cranmer. Latimer and Ridley were burned together in Oxford in October 1555. As the flames rose around them, Latimer reportedly said to his companion, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England, as I trust shall never be put out. These words became one of the most famous utterances of the English Reformation. Thomas Cranmer, the architect of the English Reformation, faced a more complicated end. Under pressure, he signed several recantations of his Protestant beliefs. It seemed that the man who had done more than anyone to make England Protestant had finally broken. But when he was brought to the stake in March 1556, Cranmer surprised everyone. He withdrew his recantations, declared that his hand that had signed them would burn first, and died affirming his Protestant faith. He thrust his right hand into the flames, and held it there until it was consumed, crying out, "This unworthy hand!" The burnings were counterproductive. Rather than terrifying people into submission, they created sympathy for the victims and hatred for the Queen. The martyrs died with courage and faith that impressed even hostile observers. Their stories were recorded and would later be published in John Fox's famous Book of Martyrs, which shaped English Protestant identity for generations. Mary earned the nickname Bloody Mary, a reputation that has never been rehabilitated. Mary's reign was troubled by more than religious conflict. The economy struggled with inflation and harvest failures. War with France, which Mary entered to support her husband Philip, went badly. In January 1558, England lost Calais, its last possession, on the French mainland. Calais had been English for over 200 years, and its loss was a national humiliation. Mary reportedly said that when she died, Calais would be found written on her heart. The Queen's health was failing. She had never been robust, and the disappointments of her reign had taken their toll. By the autumn of 1558, it was clear that she was dying. She had no children, and the crown would pass to her half-sister Elizabeth, the daughter of Anne Boleyn. Mary knew that Elizabeth was Protestant and would undo everything she had worked to accomplish. It was a bitter end to a bitter reign. Mary I died on November 17, 1558, at the age of 42. She had reigned for just over 5 years. Her attempt to restore Catholicism had failed, and her persecution of Protestants had permanently damaged the Catholic cause in England. The burnings she authorised would be remembered for centuries, shaping English attitudes toward Catholicism and toward Mary herself. Yet Mary deserves some sympathy. She was a woman who had suffered greatly and who acted according to her sincere beliefs. She genuinely believed that she was saving souls by burning heretics, that a brief agony in this life was preferable to eternal damnation in the next. This belief seems monstrous to modern sensibilities, but it was widely shared in Mary's time. Protestant rulers burned Catholics with equal conviction. Mary was also a capable administrator who worked hard at the business of government. She reformed the currency, which had been debased under her predecessors. She supported naval development and exploration. She tried to address economic problems and social unrest. These achievements are often overlooked because of the religious persecution that dominates her legacy. The tragedy of Mary's reign is that her sincere faith led her to actions that achieved the opposite of what she intended. By burning Protestants, she strengthened rather than weakened the Protestant cause. By marrying Philip of Spain, she associated Catholicism with foreign domination. By dying childless, she ensured that a Protestant would succeed her. Everything she worked for crumbled to dust. Mary was buried in Westminster Abbey, where she still lies today. Ironically, she shares a tomb with Elizabeth, the half-sister she despised. The inscription on their monument, added long after both were dead, reads, "Partners both in throne and grave, here rest we two sisters, Elizabeth and Mary, in the hope of one resurrection." Elizabeth Tudor was born on September 7th, 1533, at Greenwich Palace. She was the daughter of Henry VIII and Anne Boleyn, conceived in passion and born amid controversy. Her arrival was a disappointment to her father, who had desperately wanted a son. But this unwanted princess would become one of the most celebrated monarchs in English history. Elizabeth's early life was marked by upheaval and danger. She was not yet 3 years old when her mother was executed for treason. Elizabeth was declared illegitimate, just as her half-sister Mary had been. She was removed from the line of succession and relegated to a secondary position in the royal household. The little girl, who should have been a princess, was now simply Lady Elizabeth, her future uncertain. Elizabeth's childhood was spent in various royal residences, away from court and largely forgotten by her father. She was cared for by a series of governesses and servants, some kind and some indifferent. Her education, however, was excellent. She studied with some of the finest scholars in England, learning Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Spanish. She studied with some of the finest scholars in England, learning Latin, Greek, French, Italian, and Spanish. She developed a love of learning that would last her entire life. The young Elizabeth showed remarkable intelligence and self-possession. She was a serious child who understood from an early age that she lived in a dangerous world. She learned to guard her words, to observe more than she spoke, and to trust few people completely. These habits of caution would serve her well in the years ahead. Elizabeth's position improved somewhat after Henry married Catherine Parr in 1543. The new queen took an interest in all 3 of Henry's children and worked to bring them together as a family. Elizabeth developed a genuine affection for her stepmother, who encouraged her studies and treated her with kindness. For a few years, Elizabeth enjoyed something approaching normal family life. Henry VIII died in January 1547, when Elizabeth was 13. Her half-brother Edward became king, and Elizabeth's position remained secure. She continued her education, corresponding with scholars and impressing visitors with her learning. She was now 3rd in line to the throne, after Edward and Mary, though still officially illegitimate. But danger soon found Elizabeth. After Henry's death, Catherine Parr married Thomas Seymour, the brother of the Lord Protector Somerset. Seymour was an ambitious and reckless man who saw Elizabeth as a potential path to power. He began paying inappropriate attention to the teenage princess, entering her bedchamber in the mornings, tickling her, and engaging in behaviour that was at best improper and at worst predatory. Catherine Parr initially participated in some of these games, perhaps not understanding their true nature. But when she discovered Seymour alone with Elizabeth in an embrace, she sent the girl away. Elizabeth left Catherine's household in May 1548, never to see her stepmother again. Catherine died in childbirth later that year. Thomas Seymour's ambitions led him to disaster. He was arrested in early 1549 on charges of plotting to marry Elizabeth without the council's permission and of other treasonous schemes. Elizabeth was interrogated about her relationship with Seymour. The questioning was intense, designed to implicate her in his plots. Elizabeth handled herself with remarkable skill for a 15-year-old, admitting nothing that could be used against her while appearing cooperative and innocent. Seymour was executed in March 1549. When Elizabeth learned of his death, she reportedly said, "This day died a man with much wit and very little judgment." It was a cool assessment that revealed how thoroughly she had learned to separate emotion from political calculation. Whatever feelings she may have had for Seymour, she would not let them compromise her safety. Elizabeth remained in the background during the rest of Edward's reign. She visited court occasionally, but spent most of her time in the countryside, studying and waiting. She was careful to conform to the Protestant religious settlement, attending services and avoiding any appearance of Catholic sympathy. She understood that her survival depended on not attracting unwanted attention. The crisis came when Edward died in 1553 and Mary became queen. Elizabeth was now in grave danger. She was Protestant, she was the daughter of Anne Boleyn, and she was the focus of Protestant hopes. Mary distrusted her profoundly and suspected her of plotting to seize the throne. Elizabeth tried to navigate these treacherous waters with her usual caution. She attended Mass and made outward shows of Catholic conformity, though Mary doubted her sincerity. She stayed away from court as much as possible, pleading illness when summoned. She avoided any involvement in conspiracies against her sister, but when Wyatt's rebellion broke out in 1554, Elizabeth was implicated despite her caution. The rebels had apparently planned to place her on the throne. Although no evidence directly connected Elizabeth to the plot, Mary was convinced of her guilt. Elizabeth was summoned to London and imprisoned in the Tower. The weeks Elizabeth spent in the Tower were the most dangerous of her life. She fully expected to be executed, as her mother had been in the same place 18 years earlier. She wrote a desperate letter to Mary, protesting her innocence and begging for a personal meeting. Mary refused to see her. Elizabeth was eventually released from the Tower and placed under house arrest at Woodstock in Oxfordshire. She remained there for nearly a year, closely watched and forbidden contact with the outside world. It was a miserable existence, but she was alive. She had survived where others had fallen. Elizabeth was finally allowed to return to court in 1555, though she remained under suspicion. She attended Mass, professed Catholic beliefs, and did everything possible to avoid giving offence. She waited knowing that Mary's health was failing and that her time might yet come. When Mary died in November 1558, Elizabeth was at Hatfield House in Hertfordshire. Messengers brought her the news, along with Mary's ring as proof of her death. Elizabeth reportedly fell to her knees and quoted a psalm in Latin. "This is the Lord's doing. It is marvellous in our eyes." After years of danger and uncertainty, she was finally queen. Elizabeth was 25 years old when she came to the throne. She was tall and slender, with her father's red-gold hair and her mother's dark eyes. She was highly educated, fluent in multiple languages, and possessed of a sharp wit and a gift for rhetoric. She had survived imprisonment, suspicion, and the constant threat of execution. She had learned lessons about power and survival that would guide her for the rest of her life. The new queen faced enormous challenges. The country was divided by religion, exhausted by Mary's persecutions, and humiliated by the loss of Calais. The treasury was depleted. Relations with both France and Spain were troubled. Many doubted that a woman could rule effectively. Some questioned whether Elizabeth, as the daughter of Anne Boleyn, was even legitimate. Elizabeth assembled a team of capable advisers to help her navigate these challenges. The most important was William Cecil, who would serve her faithfully for 40 years. Cecil was a moderate Protestant, a skilled administrator, and a cautious diplomat. He and Elizabeth did not always agree, but they developed a working relationship based on mutual respect and shared goals. The religious settlement was Elizabeth's first major task. She had to find a middle way between the Catholicism of Mary's reign and the more radical Protestantism of Edward's. The solution, embodied in the Act of Supremacy and the Act of Uniformity of 1559, established what became known as the Elizabethan religious settlement. Elizabeth became Supreme Governor of the Church of England, a title slightly less provocative than her father's Supreme Head. The Book of Common Prayer was restored, in a version that tried to accommodate both Protestant and moderate Catholic sensibilities. Clergy were required to use the prayer book, but enforcement was relatively gentle. The goal was to create a broad church that most English people could accept, even if it fully satisfied no one. The settlement was a masterpiece of ambiguity. It was Protestant enough to satisfy most reformers, but retained enough traditional elements to ease the transition for those attached to the old ways. It avoided the detailed theological definitions that divided Protestants from each other. It emphasized outward conformity while allowing considerable latitude in private belief. It was, in short, a typically Elizabethan compromise. Elizabeth's personal religious beliefs remained somewhat mysterious. She was certainly Protestant, but she retained a fondness for ceremony, music, and visual beauty in worship that troubled more radical reformers. She kept a crucifix in her private chapel to the horror of her Protestant bishops. She disliked married clergy and made her disapproval known. She was not interested in theological disputes and wanted her church to be a source of unity rather than division. The question of Elizabeth's marriage dominated the early years of her reign. Everyone expected her to marry and produce an heir. A queen without a husband was an anomaly, and a queen without children left the succession dangerously uncertain. Parliament repeatedly urged her to marry. Foreign princes lined up to seek her hand. Her counsellors debated endlessly about which suitor would be most advantageous. Elizabeth played the marriage game with consummate skill. She entertained proposals from the kings of Spain and Sweden, from archdukes and dukes, from French princes and English nobles. She negotiated, flirted, and kept her options open. But she never committed. Year after year, the marriage question remained unresolved. Whether Elizabeth ever seriously intended to marry is one of the great mysteries of her reign. She may have been traumatized by her early experiences, by her mother's execution, and Thomas Seymour's inappropriate advances. She may have calculated that marriage would diminish her power, forcing her to share authority with a husband. She may simply have preferred her independence. Whatever her reasons, she remained unmarried, earning the nickname the Virgin Queen. The early years of Elizabeth's reign established patterns that would continue for decades. She relied on a small group of trusted advisers while keeping ultimate decisions in her own hands. She managed Parliament with a combination of charm, stubbornness, and occasional displays of temper. She cultivated her image carefully, presenting herself as a devoted mother to her people. She avoided war when possible, but prepared for it when necessary. Elizabeth also began to develop the elaborate court culture that would characterize her reign. She loved music, dancing, and theatrical performances. She dressed magnificently, using her appearance as a tool of statecraft. She went on summer progresses through her kingdom, staying at the houses of her nobles and showing herself to her people. She created around herself an aura of majesty and mystery that fascinated her contemporaries and continues to fascinate us today. The reign of Elizabeth I is often called the Elizabethan Golden Age, a time of extraordinary cultural achievement and national confidence. During the 4.5 decades that Elizabeth sat on the throne, England produced some of the greatest literature, drama, and music in its history. The arts flourished as never before, creating works that still move and inspire us more than 4 centuries later. The theatre was the most distinctive art form of the Elizabethan age. Before Elizabeth's reign, English drama consisted mainly of religious plays and simple entertainments. By the time she died, England had produced a theatrical tradition that rivaled anything in Europe. The names of the great Elizabethan playwrights still resonate today: Christopher Marlowe, Ben Jonson, and above all, William Shakespeare. William Shakespeare was born in Stratford-upon-Avon in 1564, 6 years into Elizabeth's reign. He came to London as a young man and began working in the theatre as an actor and playwright. His early plays showed promise, but it was in the 1590s that his genius fully emerged. Plays like Romeo and Juliet, A Midsummer Night's Dream, and Richard III established him as the leading dramatist of his generation. Shakespeare's plays were performed at theatres like the Globe, which could hold up to 3,000 spectators. Audiences included everyone from groundlings who paid a penny to stand in the yard to wealthy patrons who sat in covered galleries. The theatre was a democratic entertainment that brought together all levels of society. Apprentices rubbed shoulders with merchants, servants with gentlemen. The plays themselves reflected the richness and complexity of Elizabethan life. Shakespeare wrote comedies full of wit and wordplay, tragedies that explored the depths of human suffering, histories that dramatised England's past. His characters were vivid and memorable, from the melancholy Hamlet to the jealous Othello, from the ambitious Macbeth to the foolish Falstaff. His language combined poetry and plain speech, high rhetoric and low comedy in ways that no one had achieved before. Christopher Marlowe was Shakespeare's great rival, a brilliant and controversial figure who might have equalled Shakespeare's achievements had he lived longer. Marlowe's plays, including Tamburlaine the Great, Dr. Faustus, and The Jew of Malta, featured towering protagonists who challenged the limits of human ambition. His mighty line of blank verse transformed English dramatic poetry. But Marlowe died in 1593, stabbed in a tavern brawl at the age of 29, leaving behind a body of work that hints at what might have been. Ben Jonson represented a different theatrical tradition, more classical and satirical than Shakespeare's romantic approach. His comedies, like Volpone and The Alchemist, skewered the follies and vices of contemporary society. He was a learned man who prided himself on his knowledge of ancient literature and his adherence to classical dramatic rules. He and Shakespeare were friends and rivals, each respecting the other's talents while pursuing different artistic goals. Poetry flourished alongside drama during Elizabeth's reign. Edmund Spenser wrote The Fairy Queen, an epic poem that celebrated Elizabeth as the embodiment of Protestant virtue and English glory. The poem was dense with allegory and rich with beautiful language. It established Spenser as the greatest English poet since Chaucer and influenced generations of writers who followed. Sir Philip Sidney was the ideal of the Elizabethan gentleman, equally accomplished in poetry, prose, and military affairs. His sonnet sequence Astrophil and Stella helped establish the sonnet as a major English form. His prose romance Arcadia was one of the most popular books of the age. His defence of poetry argued eloquently for the value of imaginative literature. Sidney died young, killed in battle in the Netherlands in 1586, and was mourned as a national hero. The sonnets became the fashionable poetic form of the 1590s. Shakespeare wrote 154 sonnets that explored love, beauty, time, and mortality with unmatched depth and complexity. Other poets, including Samuel Daniel, Michael Drayton, and Spenser himself, produced sonnet sequences that added to the richness of Elizabethan poetry. The form allowed for both personal expression and artistic virtuosity. Music was another glory of the Elizabethan age. English composers produced works of extraordinary beauty and sophistication. Thomas Tallis, who had served under 4 Tudor monarchs, created sacred music that ranged from simple hymns to complex polyphonic works. His motet, Spem in Alium, written for 40 separate voice parts, remains one of the most ambitious choral works ever composed. William Byrd was perhaps the greatest English composer of the age. He wrote music for both the Catholic and Protestant traditions, navigating the religious divisions of his time with remarkable skill. His masses, motets, and keyboard works display a mastery of technique combined with deep emotional expression. He also composed secular songs and instrumental pieces that were popular among amateur musicians. John Dowland was the master of the lute song, a form that combined poetry and music in intimate, expressive performances. His melancholy songs, with titles like Flow My Tears and In Darkness Let Me Dwell, captured the fashionable mood of Elizabethan melancholy. Dowland was famous throughout Europe, and spent years in the service of foreign courts before returning to England late in his career. Music was not confined to professional composers and performers. Elizabeth herself was an accomplished musician who played the virginals, a keyboard instrument similar to the harpsichord. Music was considered an essential part of a gentleman's education, and many Elizabethans could sing, play instruments, and read musical notation. Madrigals, part songs for multiple voices, were popular entertainments at social gatherings. The visual arts developed more slowly in England than on the continent, but the Elizabethan age saw significant achievements. Nicholas Hilliard was the master of the miniature portrait, creating tiny, jewel-like images that captured the faces of Elizabeth and her courtiers. These miniatures were often worn as jewellery or exchanged as tokens of love and loyalty. Hilliard's delicate technique and ability to convey personality in a small space made him the most sought-after artist of his time. Larger portraits also flourished, though often painted by foreign artists or by English painters trained abroad. The images of Elizabeth herself became increasingly stylized and symbolic as her reign progressed. She was depicted with elaborate costumes, symbolic accessories, and an ageless face that bore little resemblance to her actual appearance. These portraits were propaganda as much as art, projecting an image of eternal majesty. Architecture reflected the wealth and confidence of the Elizabethan age. Great houses like Longleat, Hardwicke Hall and Burghley House displayed the power and taste of their owners. These buildings featured large windows, elaborate chimneys, and symmetrical facades that showed the influence of Renaissance design. They were built for comfort and display rather than defence, reflecting the relative peace and stability of Elizabeth's reign. Gardens became increasingly elaborate during the Elizabethan period. Formal gardens with geometric patterns, fountains and carefully trimmed hedges surrounded the great houses. Knot gardens, with intricate designs of low hedges filled with flowers or coloured gravel, were particularly fashionable. Gardens were places for walking, conversation, and romantic encounters, settings for the elaborate social rituals of the Elizabethan elite. Literature extended beyond poetry and drama to include prose works of various kinds. Travel narratives described the voyages of English explorers to distant lands. Richard Hakluyt compiled accounts of English exploration in his principal navigations, a massive work that celebrated English maritime achievement. Historical chronicles, philosophical treatises, and religious works all found eager readers. Education expanded during Elizabeth's reign. Grammar schools provided education to boys from middling families, teaching Latin, rhetoric, and the classics. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge trained clergy, lawyers, and administrators. Literacy rates increased, though they remained far below modern levels. The growing availability of printed books helped spread knowledge and ideas. The printing press transformed English culture during the Elizabethan age. Books became cheaper and more widely available. Pamphlets and broadsides spread news and opinions. The Bible, now available in English, could be read by anyone who was literate. The press created new opportunities for writers and new challenges for authorities who wanted to control the flow of information. Elizabeth herself was a significant patron of the arts and learning. She supported poets, musicians, and scholars with gifts and positions. She attended theatrical performances and encouraged the development of English drama. Her court was a centre of cultural activity, attracting talented individuals from across the country and beyond. The Queen's own literary abilities were considerable. She wrote poetry, translated classical works, and delivered speeches that demonstrated her mastery of rhetoric. Her speech to the troops at Tilbury in 1588, as England prepared to face the Spanish Armada, is one of the most famous pieces of English oratory. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she declared, but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too. The cultural achievements of the Elizabethan age were inseparable from the political and economic conditions that made them possible. The relative peace and stability of Elizabeth's reign allowed the arts to flourish. The growing wealth of the merchant class created new patrons and new audiences. The religious settlement, whatever its limitations, avoided the worst extremes of persecution and allowed a degree of intellectual freedom. The Elizabethan Golden Age also had its darker aspects. The glittering culture of the court coexisted with widespread poverty and suffering. The theatres that entertained thousands stood near bear-baiting pits and public executions. The beautiful poetry celebrated love and beauty, while real people faced disease, hunger, and early death. The age was golden for some, but not for all. Nevertheless, the cultural legacy of Elizabeth's reign remains extraordinary. The works produced during these decades continue to be read, performed, and admired around the world. Shakespeare's plays are staged in every country. Elizabethan music is performed by choirs and ensembles. The great houses of the period attract visitors who marvel at their beauty. The Elizabethan age set standards of artistic achievement that later generations have struggled to match. The reign of Elizabeth I was not merely a time of cultural flowering, it was also an age of danger, when England faced threats from abroad and conspiracies at home. Elizabeth navigated these perils with skill and determination, preserving her throne and her kingdom against formidable enemies. The greatest threat came from Catholic powers who viewed Protestant England as a heretic nation to be brought back to the true faith. Spain under King Philip II was the champion of the Catholic cause. Philip had been married to Mary Tudor and had hoped to maintain Spanish influence in England after her death. When Elizabeth came to the throne and restored Protestantism, Philip initially tried to maintain peaceful relations. He even proposed marriage to Elizabeth, hoping to keep England within the Catholic orbit through diplomacy rather than force. For many years, Philip maintained an uneasy peace with England. He even defended Elizabeth from the Pope's threat of excommunication, recognizing that open conflict would upset the balance of power in Europe. But tensions gradually increased as Elizabeth supported Protestant causes abroad and English sailors raided Spanish shipping. The relationship between the two monarchs deteriorated from cautious friendship to open hostility. The situation in the Netherlands was a major source of conflict. Philip faced increasing religious disturbances as Protestantism gained followers in his territories in the Low Countries. As a defender of the Catholic Church, he sought to suppress the rising Protestant movement, which eventually exploded into open rebellion in 1566. Elizabeth sympathised with the Dutch Protestants and eventually allied England with the Protestant rebels in the Netherlands. This intervention infuriated Philip and brought the two nations closer to war. English privateers added to the tensions. Men like Francis Drake and John Hawkins raided Spanish ships and ports in the Caribbean and along the Spanish Main. They seized treasure, disrupted trade, and humiliated the mighty Spanish Empire. Elizabeth officially disapproved of these activities while secretly investing in the voyages and sharing in the profits. Drake's circumnavigation of the globe between 1577 and 1580 was both a remarkable feat of seamanship and a prolonged raid on Spanish possessions. Francis Drake was the most famous of the Elizabethan sea dogs. Born in Devon around 1540, he went to sea as a young man and quickly showed his abilities as a sailor and a fighter. His raids on Spanish America made him wealthy and famous. The Spanish called him El Draque and considered him a pirate. The English celebrated him as a hero. Elizabeth knighted him aboard his ship, the Golden Hind, after his voyage around the world. The religious dimension of the conflict cannot be overlooked. Pope Sixtus V declared a crusade against the heretics of England. Philip saw himself as the champion of Catholicism and he believed that what was good for the Catholic King of Spain was good for all of Christendom. The war between England and Spain was not merely a political conflict, but a religious crusade, at least in the eyes of many participants. Within England, Catholic plots threatened Elizabeth's life and throne. The most dangerous of these centred on Mary, Queen of Scots, who had fled to England in 1568 after being deposed by her Protestant subjects. Mary was the Catholic great-granddaughter of Henry VII, and English Catholics disputed the validity of Henry VIII's marriage to Anne Boleyn, claiming that Mary Stuart was the rightful monarch. Mary, Queen of Scots, was Elizabeth's cousin and her most dangerous rival. She was beautiful, charming, and Catholic. She had been Queen of France briefly and Queen of Scotland for longer. Her tumultuous reign in Scotland had ended in scandal and civil war, forcing her to seek refuge in England. Elizabeth faced a dilemma. She could not send Mary back to Scotland, where she would likely be killed. She could not let her go to France or Spain, where she might gather an army. And she could not keep her in England without the constant threat of Catholic conspiracies forming around her. For nearly 20 years, Mary remained Elizabeth's prisoner, moved from castle to castle, always watched, always dangerous. Plot after plot was discovered, each one aiming to assassinate Elizabeth and place Mary on the throne. The Ridolfi plot of 1571, the Throckmorton plot of 1583, and the Babington plot of 1586 all sought to achieve this goal. Elizabeth's spy master, Francis Walsingham, worked tirelessly to uncover these conspiracies and protect his queen. Francis Walsingham was one of the most remarkable figures of the Elizabethan age. He built an intelligence network that stretched across Europe, employing agents, informers, and code breakers to gather information about threats to England. He was a committed Protestant who saw the Catholic powers as existential enemies. His methods were sometimes ruthless, but his dedication to Elizabeth's safety was absolute. The Babington plot finally sealed Mary's fate. Anthony Babington, a young Catholic gentleman, organised a conspiracy to assassinate Elizabeth and free Mary. Walsingham's agents intercepted the correspondence between Babington and Mary, including a letter in which Mary appeared to approve the assassination plan. Whether Mary actually wrote this letter, or whether it was forged or altered by Walsingham's agents, remains debated by historians. But the evidence was enough to condemn her. Mary, Queen of Scots, was tried for treason in October 1586. She defended herself with dignity, denying the charges and questioning the court's authority to try an anointed queen. But the verdict was never in doubt. She was found guilty and sentenced to death. Elizabeth hesitated for months before signing the death warrant, torn between the political necessity of removing Mary and her reluctance to execute a fellow monarch. Mary was beheaded at Fotheringhay Castle on February 8, 1587. She went to her death with courage and composure, dressed in red, the colour of Catholic martyrdom. Her execution removed the immediate threat of Catholic succession, but inflamed Catholic opinion across Europe. Philip of Spain now had both a cause and an excuse for the invasion he had long contemplated. The Spanish Armada of 1588 was the greatest military enterprise of the age. Philip assembled a massive force of over 30,000 men and 130 ships. The strategic aim was to overthrow Queen Elizabeth and the Tudor establishment of Protestantism in England. The fleet would sail to the Netherlands, pick up additional troops under the Duke of Parma, and then invade England. It was an ambitious plan that required precise coordination and favourable weather. The Armada set sail from Lisbon in May 1588, but storms forced it to take shelter in Corunna. It finally entered the English Channel in late July. The English fleet, commanded by Lord Howard of Effingham with Drake as his vice-admiral, shadowed the Spanish ships as they made their way up the Channel. There were several engagements, but the English could not break the Armada's tight defensive formation. The decisive moment came at Calais, where the Armada anchored to await contact with Parma's forces. The English sent fireships into the anchorage, forcing the Spanish ships to cut their cables and scatter. The following day, the Battle of Gravelines saw fierce fighting as the English attacked the disorganized Spanish fleet. The English ships were smaller and more maneuverable, and their guns could fire more rapidly. The Spanish suffered significant losses and were driven northward. The Armada could not return through the Channel, where the English fleet waited. Instead, it was forced to sail around Scotland and Ireland to reach home. Storms battered the fleet as it made this long and dangerous voyage. Ships were wrecked on the rocky coasts of Scotland and Ireland. Thousands of Spanish sailors and soldiers drowned or were killed by hostile locals when they came ashore. Of the 130 ships that had set out, fewer than half returned to Spain. The defeat of the Spanish Armada was a defining moment in English history. It preserved Protestant England from Catholic invasion. It demonstrated that Spain was not invincible. It boosted English confidence and national pride. The victory was attributed to divine providence, to the skill of English sailors, and to the storms that had scattered the Spanish fleet. A medal struck to commemorate the victory bore the inscription, "God blew, and they were scattered." Elizabeth's speech to her troops at Tilbury, delivered as the Armada approached, became one of the most famous pieces of English oratory. She appeared before her soldiers in armour, mounted on a white horse, and declared her willingness to die alongside them. "I know I have the body of a weak and feeble woman," she said, "but I have the heart and stomach of a king, and of a king of England too, and think foul scorn that Parma or Spain or any prince of Europe should dare to invade the borders of my realm." The war with Spain continued for the rest of Elizabeth's reign and beyond. There were further armadas, further raids, and further battles. English forces intervened in France to support the Protestant Henry of Navarre. English troops fought in the Netherlands alongside the Dutch rebels. The conflict drained resources and caused suffering, but it also forged a sense of English Protestant identity that would endure for centuries. Ireland was another theatre of conflict during Elizabeth's reign. English rule in Ireland was contested by Gaelic chieftains and by Catholic lords who resented Protestant domination. Rebellions broke out repeatedly, most seriously in Ulster under Hugh O'Neill, Earl of Tyrone. The 9 Years' War, from 1594 to 1603, was a brutal conflict that devastated much of Ireland. English forces eventually prevailed, but only after enormous expenditure of blood and treasure. The Irish Wars revealed the darker side of Elizabethan England. English commanders employed scorched earth tactics, destroying crops and livestock to starve the population into submission. Massacres occurred on both sides. The conflict planted seeds of bitterness that would bear fruit for centuries. Ireland remained a problem that Elizabeth never solved, a drain on resources and a source of constant anxiety. Elizabeth's later years were marked by a sense of decline and loss. The great figures of her early reign died one by one. Leicester, her longtime favourite, died in 1588. Walsingham followed in 1590. William Cecil, Lord Berkeley, who had served her for 40 years, died in 1598. The Queen was increasingly isolated, surrounded by a new generation of courtiers who had not shared the struggles of her early reign. Robert Devereux, Earl of Essex, was the most prominent of these younger courtiers. He was handsome, charming, and ambitious, and Elizabeth was clearly fond of him despite their age difference. But Essex was also reckless and arrogant. He quarrelled with the Queen, defied her orders, and eventually led a disastrous expedition to Ireland that ended in failure and disgrace. In 1601, Essex attempted a rebellion against Elizabeth. He marched through London with a small band of followers, hoping to raise the city against the Queen's counsellors. The uprising was a complete failure. Essex was arrested, tried for treason, and executed. Elizabeth signed his death warrant without the hesitation she had shown with Mary, Queen of Scots. But the execution of her former favourite left her melancholy and withdrawn. The final years of Elizabeth's reign were shadowed by economic difficulties, war weariness, and uncertainty about the succession. The Queen refused to name her successor, keeping everyone guessing until the end. But it was widely understood that James VI of Scotland, the son of Mary, Queen of Scots, would inherit the English throne. James was Protestant, he was descended from Henry VII, and he was already a king. He was the obvious choice. Elizabeth I died on March 24, 1603, at Richmond Palace. She was 69 years old and had reigned for 44 years. According to tradition, she indicated on her deathbed that James should succeed her, though she may have been too weak to speak clearly. Within hours of her death, messengers were riding north to inform James that he was now King of England as well as Scotland. The Tudor dynasty ended with Elizabeth's death. She was the last of Henry VII's descendants to wear the English crown. The dynasty that had begun with an improbable victory at Bosworth Field concluded with the peaceful succession of a Scottish king. England had been transformed during the Tudor century, and the changes would endure long after the Tudors themselves were gone. As we come to the close of our journey through Tudor history, let us pause to reflect on what this remarkable dynasty achieved and what legacy they left behind. The Tudors ruled England for 118 years, from Henry VII's victory at Bosworth Field in 1485 to Elizabeth I's death in 1603. In that time, they transformed their kingdom in ways that continue to shape the world today. The religious transformation was perhaps the most profound change. When Henry VII became king, England was a Catholic country, loyal to the Pope in Rome, its religious life shaped by centuries of Catholic tradition. When Elizabeth died, England was Protestant, its church independent of Rome, its religious identity fundamentally altered. This change affected every aspect of English life, from the grandest cathedral to the humblest village church. The break with Rome under Henry VIII was initially a political act, driven by the king's desire for an annulment that the Pope would not grant. But it set in motion changes that went far beyond Henry's intentions. The dissolution of the monasteries redistributed vast amounts of land and wealth. The introduction of English language worship made religion accessible to ordinary people. The theological debates of the Reformation forced people to think about their faith in new ways. The religious settlement that Elizabeth established proved remarkably durable. The Church of England, neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, created a middle way that most English people could accept. The Book of Common Prayer, with its beautiful language and its careful ambiguities, shaped English worship for centuries. The Anglican tradition that emerged from the Elizabethan settlement spread around the world with English colonisation and remains a major branch of Christianity today. The Tudors also transformed the English monarchy. Henry VII rebuilt royal finances and royal authority after the chaos of the Wars of the Roses. Henry VIII asserted royal supremacy over the Church, making the monarch the head of both state and religion. Elizabeth demonstrated that a woman could rule as effectively as any man, governing for nearly half a century with skill and determination. The Tudor monarchs worked with Parliament more closely than their predecessors had done. The great religious and constitutional changes of the period were enacted through parliamentary statutes, giving them a legitimacy that royal proclamations alone could not provide. Parliament grew in importance and developed new procedures during the Tudor era. The seeds of parliamentary sovereignty, which would flower in the following century, were planted during Tudor times. The Tudors presided over a cultural flowering that produced some of the greatest works in the English language. The plays of Shakespeare, the poetry of Spenser, the music of Tallis and Byrd, the prose of the Book of Common Prayer, and the King James Bible all emerged from the Tudor era or its immediate aftermath. English literature came of age during these years, developing a richness and sophistication that it had previously lacked. The English language itself was transformed during the Tudor period. The introduction of the printing press, standardized spelling and grammar. The translation of the Bible into English gave ordinary people access to scripture in their own tongue. The great writers of the age expanded the vocabulary and explored the possibilities of English prose and poetry. The language that emerged from the Tudor era was recognisably modern English, the ancestor of the global language spoken by billions today. Education expanded under the Tudors. Grammar schools spread across England, providing education to boys from middling families. The universities of Oxford and Cambridge trained the clergy, lawyers, and administrators who ran the country. Literacy rates increased, though they remained far below modern levels. The foundations were laid for the educated society that would emerge in later centuries. The Tudors began England's transformation from an insular kingdom to a global power. The voyages of exploration that began under Henry VII continued throughout the Tudor era. English sailors explored the coasts of North America, sought the Northwest Passage, and traded with distant lands. The first attempts at colonization, though unsuccessful during Tudor times, pointed the way toward the British Empire that would emerge in the following centuries. The navy that the Tudors built became the foundation of English maritime power. Henry VIII invested heavily in warships and dockyards. Elizabeth's navy defeated the Spanish Armada and established England as a major naval power. The tradition of English sea power that began under the Tudors would eventually make Britain the dominant maritime nation in the world. The Tudor era also saw the beginnings of English involvement in Ireland that would have profound and often tragic consequences. The Tudor conquest of Ireland established English Protestant rule over a Catholic population. The plantations that began under Elizabeth brought English and Scottish settlers to Irish land. The conflicts and resentments that arose during this period would poison relations between England and Ireland for centuries. The Tudors left behind magnificent buildings that still stand today. Hampton Court Palace, with its great hall and its beautiful gardens, remains one of the finest examples of Tudor architecture. The great houses built by Tudor nobles and gentlemen dot the English countryside. Even modest buildings from the period, with their distinctive half-timbered construction, are treasured as links to the Tudor past. The images of the Tudor monarchs remain instantly recognisable. Henry VIII, massive and imposing in his portraits by Holbein, has become the archetypal image of English kingship. Elizabeth, with her white face, red hair, and elaborate costumes, is one of the most depicted figures in English history. These images have been reproduced countless times in paintings, films, and television programmes, keeping the Tudors alive in popular imagination. The personal stories of the Tudors continue to fascinate us. Henry VIII's 6 wives, with their varied fates, have inspired countless books, plays and films. The tragic story of Lady Jane Grey, the 9 Days Queen, still moves us with its pathos. Elizabeth's long reign, her refusal to marry, and her careful cultivation of her image as the Virgin Queen remain subjects of endless speculation and debate. The Tudors were not saints. Henry VIII executed 2 wives and countless others who crossed him. Mary burned nearly 300 Protestants for heresy. Elizabeth authorised torture and execution for those she considered traitors. The Tudor era was violent and often cruel by modern standards. We should not romanticize these monarchs or overlook the suffering they caused. Yet the Tudors also displayed remarkable qualities. Henry VII showed patience and cunning in establishing his dynasty against long odds. Henry VIII, for all his faults, was a genuine Renaissance prince, cultured, intelligent, and capable of inspiring loyalty. Edward VI, though he died young, showed promise as a thoughtful and conscientious ruler. Mary, despite her failures, was sincere in her faith and worked hard at the business of government. Elizabeth combined intelligence, courage, and political skill in ways that few monarchs have matched. The Tudor dynasty ended peacefully, with the crown passing to James VI of Scotland, who became James I of England. The union of the English and Scottish crowns under James was a momentous event, though the full union of the two kingdoms would not come until a century later. The Tudors had prepared the way for this union through the marriage of Henry VII's daughter Margaret to James IV of Scotland, from which James VI was descended. The legacy of the Tudors extends far beyond England. The English language that they helped shape is now spoken around the world. The Protestant tradition that they established spread to North America, Australia, and other lands settled by English colonists. The parliamentary institutions that developed during their reign influenced constitutional development in many countries. The literary and artistic achievements of their era remain part of the common heritage of humanity. As we conclude our exploration of the House of Tudor, let us remember that these were real people who lived, loved, struggled, and died. They faced challenges that would have overwhelmed lesser individuals. They made decisions that shaped the lives of millions. They left behind a legacy that we still live with today. The story of the Tudors is ultimately a human story. It is a story of ambition and faith, of love and betrayal, of triumph and tragedy. It is a story that began in the hills of Wales with an obscure family dreaming of greatness. It is a story that ended with a childless queen dying in her palace, the last of her line. Between those 2 points lies one of the most dramatic and consequential chapters in English history. The Tudors changed England forever. They broke with Rome and established a new church. They dissolved the monasteries and redistributed their wealth. They built a navy and began the expansion that would create a global empire. They patronized artists and writers who produced works of enduring beauty. They strengthened the monarchy while also strengthening Parliament. They made England Protestant, confident, and outward-looking. We are all, in some sense, heirs of the Tudors. The English-speaking world that they helped create now spans the globe. The religious traditions they established continue to shape millions of lives. The literature they inspired is still read and performed. The institutions they developed have influenced governments around the world. The Tudors may be gone, but their legacy lives on. And so we come to the end of our journey through Tudor England. We have travelled from the battlefield of Bosworth to the deathbed of Elizabeth, from the green hills of Wales to the glittering courts of Greenwich and Whitehall. We have met kings and queens, saints and sinners, heroes and villains. We have witnessed religious revolution, cultural flowering, and military triumph. We have seen the best and worst of human nature on display.